Chapter 1387. Published at 21st of November 2022 9:47 and 12 seconds AM. Chapter 1387. At once, if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1387. At once, Lionel's words seemed to light a fuse under an atmosphere that just barely seemed to be calming. Many more had survived than one would have thought, much due to Lionel's previous actions. However, in that moment, everyone seemed to remember the original reason why they had all suddenly ended up in this place. Amory seemed to not have heard Lionel at all, his expression just the same as always. And oddly enough, despite him continuing to walk and even close in on the egg, Lionel still hadn't looked in his direction. The youths no longer had much of a choice. There were 2 amethyst tokens handed out this year, and it felt that neither was undeserving. The tension alone seemed to prove this. In any other situation, those who knew well of Amory's strength would have called Lionel foolish. In fact, even at this point, the bias toward him was still very much real. The difference was that it was far less vocal than it had been in the past. Amory stepped through the maze of eggs, ignoring them all. By this point, the Rapax that remained had grown too weak to do much of anything. The sudden appearance of the shadows had taken out a lot of their remaining strength, and the reinforcements they had been waiting on still hadn't appeared. It was unlikely at this point that they would ever appear now. The strongest of them was the only one that had still had the strength to move around. However, he had found himself crushed by the variant invalid even before he could go out in his final blaze of glory. Lionel watched silently as the Rapax gathered up the last of their strength, pushing themselves up from the ground and steadily walking toward Amory. Lionel didn't do anything as Amory brandished his sword, cutting them down one after another. No matter how many Rapax fell, another would appear in their place. Even in their final moments, as they breathed their last and fell to the ground, they took special attention not to harm the eggs around them. Lionel would almost see through their thoughts entirely. They felt that even if the worst case happened and their future king was taken away and killed, at least what remained of the younger generation would be able to hold them up. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. To experience faster update speed. Amory didn't spare these eggs a glance. However, Lionel could tell that he didn't take any special care to hold himself back from harming them either. If it wasn't for the Rapax using their bodies, at least a dozen eggs would have already been sliced completely through, their lives becoming forfeit before they could even begin to live it. Lionel suddenly sensed a shadow looming overhead, a pair of hands clasping his cheeks and jaw and lifting his head up. He hadn't even noticed, but sitting on this damned rock, his posture had been as terrible as a Rapax, slouched and curved, his gaze transfixed to the ground. With his back to everything that was happening, it was his internal sight that aided him in spectating everything. Aina felt her heart sink when she saw Lionel's expression. His eyes were sunken and dark as though he hadn't slept in years, his face was covered in sweat that drenched her palms, and his skin felt as scalding as the surface of the sun. He was tired. And how couldn't he be? Rage could only take you so far. Using a 6th-dimensional mind was taxing, wielding and restraining atmospheric Scarlet Star Force was taxing, claiming a quasi-gold spear was taxing. He hadn't even managed to have a break all this time. Ever since he had stepped foot into Void Palace territory, it was a constant battle, a constant war. The reason he hadn't moved to stop Amory yet was because he was using the distance the latter had yet to cover as a small buffer to catch his breath. And yet, Lionel grinned. What? Am I that handsome? You look stunned. Aina was stunned for a moment, not even knowing how to react. She suddenly felt that maybe Lionel and his father weren't so different after all. It's fine, you know. You don't have to save everyone. If you have been a little less stubborn, they all could have taken a lot of burden away from you. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. Aina wasn't wrong. Whether it was the shadows, the Rapax, and especially the variant invalid, if Lionel had been just a little less hot-tempered, it would have been everyone's burden to deal with. Things had started off with Amory being the only tired one, to suddenly him having had the time to recover, while it was now Lionel who was coughing up a lung. Lionel chuckled. It was never about them or saving people. He just wanted to chop off a few heads. He just hadn't accounted for the fact that he would actually want to save a baby Rapax now. Before, he had already decided to trade off giving up on the egg in exchange for teaching the three-finger cult a lesson. Well, now that he thought about it, that decision was pretty reckless too. The three-finger cult wasn't going anywhere, but a shadow sovereign ability in his hands would be an extraordinary boon to his future. By then, it would only be a matter of time before he slaughtered them. But sometimes, Lionel somewhat liked doing the thing that wasn't the most logical. It made him feel more human. Feeling the warmth of Aina's small hands on his face, he smiled. A beauty being worried about his health was pretty nice. What more could a man ask for? Lionel reached out, grabbing his spear and slowly rising until he towered over Aina. At that moment, Amory had reached the egg, the last Rapax having fallen to his feet. He calmly took out an embroidered box as though there was no one else around him. I expect a reward for gallantly saving the world, Lionel said with a grin, still not looking toward the swordsman. Aina rolled her eyes. If we worked together, dealing with him would be easy. Sure. But I have a few debts to settle first. Amory lightly closed the lid of the box, the egg having vanished. And at that instant, both he and Lionel moved at once. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1388. Published at 21st of November 2022 9:47 and 11 seconds AM. Chapter 1388. Clear line. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1388. Clear line. Clang. Spear and sword met, an overwhelming strength traveling up Lionel's arms and making his teeth chatter. Lionel found an uncontrollable force sending him back, his feet gliding along the moist ground as waters continued to flood inward. At this point, it felt that it would only be a matter of time before they were forced to use force to glide atop the green water. Lionel's gaze shifted to Amory's blade, his lip curling when he realized it was the very same wooden sword from the day. He hadn't even bothered to take out anything better, nor did he feel like he had to. There was something very special about Amory's sword force. It was powerful and seemed to be even more useful than a blade itself. It almost felt like blasphemy to use anything other than a wooden sword because that was the only thing that could bring out its true strength. Lionel knew that this was just an illusion. Or rather, he deduced that it was an instinctual sharpness of his eye and experience coming to the conclusion. He could see through and understand much more of Amory's force now, and he knew well that it wasn't because of his spear force. Lionel's aura surged, a crown appearing upon his forehead as a shimmering golden spear took up its center. Amory seemed to respond in kind, a bright golden sword forming upon his. Clang, clang, clang. The flurry of exchanges was heated, but there was no doubt who had the upper hand. In swiftness, Amory was faster. In power, Amory was stronger. In skill, Amory was more deft and dexterous, his sword responding to every situation with the relaxation of a leaf blowing in the wind. The battle seemed to carry him from stance to stance, nothing seeming to be too difficult for him to respond to. Cuts began to appear along Lionel's body, Amory's blade treating his metallic skin like thin sheets of paper. Only the most minor of shifts and dodges managed to keep Lionel away from fatal blows, but it felt as though a trap was closing the distance around him. I see. Lionel's expression remained cold and indifferent, the smile he had had for Aina not seeming to be present in the slightest. So that's the difference between them. That's what my spear force is lacking. That's also what my bow force is lacking. It seems that there's a shortcut that fixes all of this. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed. Bang. Lionel's aura flourished. No matter how tired he was, there would always be one thing that remained unblemished and untainted, untouched by the weaknesses of the world. His will. A dense purple fog rose up, the shimmering halo above Lionel's head vibrating as he stretched out his spear, the glow suddenly infusing into it. Why did Lionel feel such reverence for Amory's swords? Why did Amory dare to call himself the sword deity? It was because his sword embodied those very characteristics. Why Star Order had already told Lionel that at the highest levels, force could curate a personality of its own. And, in that case, wouldn't that mean that the highest levels of comprehended blade forces would also have to reach such a level? To step into a realm that would be worthy of the life grade? Amory had to spend his whole life honing his blade, refining his force, and tempering his skill in order to birth a sword force that had its own dignity and pride, one that not only embodied strength, but also a loftiness that few could match. However, Lionel didn't have as many years as Amory did, nor did he need to. Lionel's king's might flooded his spear force, causing its bright golden hue to suddenly gain a violet tint. The royal violet gold color it now wafted seemed to elevate it to an all-new level. Bang! The crown upon Lionel's forehead grew a size. The singular golden spear tripled, forming two smaller units to its side, the now semicircular crown glowing with a tinge of purple now as well. I would advise that you stop. Hold back, Lionel said coldly, his spear swinging again. Clang. For the first time, Lionel's spear met Amory's blade and neither took a single step back. The viciousness of their clash was somehow completely understated, not even the slightest wind splintering outward for just a moment. And then, the cascade of booming cacophonies rampaged about, their figures becoming blurs as they weaved in and out of their clashes, the cavern slowly filling up with water as it trembled. Boom. Lionel landed heavily on the ground, his breath heavy. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net Amory landed lightly a distance away. He rose up his sword in a fencing stance, gazing upon his wooden blade with a curious eye. "All right," he said lightly. His sword swished downward. In a single motion, it seemed to have flickered and vanished. When Amory's hand rose up once more, a completely different sword had taken its place, reflecting delicate blue lights as rays shone right through it. Shine. A sword howl rose into the skies. "I'll show you a small bit of my power, so that you stop wasting my time. I've already said that your spear is weak and you don't deserve the ring on your finger. I have someone much better for it in mind. I don't fight you because I respect you. I fight you because the things you have would be better served elsewhere. I am called the sword deity Amory. Be thankful that you'll fall beneath my blade." A rising tempest pierced through the skies. Sword gashes suddenly appeared all around Amory without even his effort. It was as though he was pulling sword force from the surroundings, something that should have been completely impossible. And then it happened. The sound of a shattering barrier resounded and the howl of level 3 sword force roared through the battlefield. Amory flicked his wrist just a single time, causing a wall of white gold sword force to shoot forward like a raging tsunami. Lionel hurriedly crossed his spear across his chest, but even after bracing himself, he found his feet leaving the ground, his ribcage rattling until it shattered. However, even with the pain racking his body, he couldn't take his eyes off of the nick that had appeared in his spear. It started as a small scratch, but the sword force made it deeper and deeper. So, Lionel's eyes widened, his quasi-gold spear splitting in two, a line of sword force gaining a clear path to his chest. Chapter 1389. Published at 21st of November 2022 9:47 and 10 seconds AM. Chapter 1389. White Lions. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1389. White Lions. Lionel flew out, a large mouthful of blood flying from his mouth. But soon, the fountain became so large that no one could be sure whether it came from his lip or his torso. Bang. Lionel crashed heavily against the ground, his mind going somewhat blank for a moment. A blade force capable of slicing apart a weapon a step away from the 7th dimension. Even Lionel's Scarlet Star Force hadn't been able to destroy his current spear, it had weathered his breakthrough into Tier 6 with only some superficial cracks, and that was in the presence of the strongest fire force in all of existence. It was difficult even to wrap his head around what level of refinement a blade force needed to reach to be able to display such power. But even then, Lionel's mind seemed all too blank to even begin to parse apart something so complex. Compared to Amory, Lionel had only just entered the world of dimensions. He hated losing. In fact, that wasn't a strong phrase. He abhorred it to the very depths of his being. Losing wasn't something he ever really experienced before, but it seemed to be happening a lot in this place. He never really needed to put in any effort to win. And, quite frankly, the state of the Milky Way galaxy hadn't done much of anything to change that mindset in him. Those people were weak too. There was nothing that could push him, nothing that could really excite him. It was no wonder he had so arrogantly proclaimed that he would become king of it all. It took his father appearing once again to remind him that there was a taller mountain out there. It was just that easy to get Lionel to change his mind state. A single word from his father and everything seemed to relax. He allowed himself to open up again, but he had also become that same relaxed kid with hardly a weight on his shoulders. No, it wasn't that the weight wasn't there, it was just that he had seemingly transferred it to his father, letting him carry it for a while so that he could relax. But even with that being the case, he really hated to lose. He really hated it. It was funny for a person like him to have such a disposition. He had coasted through much of life. He coasted through school. He coasted through football. When he entered the dimensional verse, he didn't do much else other than follow Aina, so he coasted again. Then he got it in his head that he would become a king, but had he really put all the effort into that he could? He had definitely tricked himself into thinking he did. He had even abandoned the only woman he had ever really cared for because he was so convinced that he was trying his hardest and his best. But was he? No, not really. Everything was just too boring. Maybe the only excitement he got from the goal of becoming a king was all the naysayers he got because of it. Maybe that was why he had pushed Aina away to begin with. It was much more interesting when it was someone he cared about that doubted him. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, Please visit novel next. Com to experience faster update speed, but then she stopped doubting him entirely. And then she became a thorn at his side, constantly reminding him of that very same boredom, again and again. Until his father appeared. Like an angel swooping in from the skies, the old man centered him. His father was always the only one that could put him in his place, the only one that could make him feel inferior. The only one that could remind him that he couldn't always have things the way he wanted to have them. Lionel knew exactly what his problem was. It wasn't a goal, it wasn't a lack of aspiration, it was a lack of discipline, a lack of maturity, a childish lashing out by a brat annoyed his dad wasn't always by his side anymore. And suddenly, it made all the sense in the world that his dad had chosen the methods he had, to leave him in this world without backing, without support. But, even that wasn't true. How many people could have something like the spear domain? How many could have the segmented cube? A bathing of golden light fell from the skies, white gold illusory feathers falling onto Lionel's body as he rose. Alright, fine. I guess I can't have everything exactly like I want them. Lionel's palm flipped over, revealing the raging aura of a bow. The roar of twin white lions shook the cavern, an aura the likes of which none here had ever personally experienced before swallowing them whole. Amory, who had already turned away, suddenly looked back, only to find Lionel having already pulled the string of his bow tight. Level 3 bow force flourished, its howl swallowing everything in its path. For today I'll just defeat you with my bow. As for my spear, if you manage to survive this, that is, you can taste it another time. Amory's expression changed wildly as Lionel's fingers released. Clang. The first arrow had already appeared before him in the blink of an eye. Amory quickly flipped a palm, retrieving his crystalline blue sword and parrying it away. But, his hand ended up shooting off and into the air, his grip on his sword almost faltering entirely. Lionel took another step forward and released another arrow. Clang. Amory's expression turned a fiery shade of furious red, his other palm having flipped over to reveal a second sword, this one a crystalline red. Clang. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. Lionel fired again and Amory was nearly lifted from his feet, his heels digging into the ground. The latter released a low roar, his force flourishing and the whites of his eyes vanishing into an abyss of blackness. But, as though he hadn't seen anything at all, Lionel just fired again. Clang. Amory's blue sword was knocked away again. Clang. Amory's red sword was knocked away once more. Clang. Amory's robes were torn to pieces, revealing a hidden armor within. Clang. Lionel's arrow landed in the same exact spot once more, knocking Amory off his feet and sending him crashing into an opposing wall. A barrage of arrows seemed to fall from the skies. There was no technique, no deviations, it wasn't even a question where Lionel was aiming. The distance was simply too close, and having entered the range of a sniper there was no getting out of it. Arrogant. It was even more arrogant than using a wooden sword. He could have aimed for Amory's head. He could have aimed for the joints in his armor. He could have aimed for his wrists and severed his ability to ever hold a sword at all. And yet he did none of that. It was as though each arrow was another punch, another furious hit, another close combat barrage. Clang. Lionel's arrow landed in the same spot for the third time, causing Amory's inner armor to crack into countless pieces and fall into useless shards. Beseech you. Another arrow soared, but instead of taking Amory's heart, it took his finger, mangling his hand into the same unrecognizable mess the latter had left Lionel's in all those months ago. Amory fell to a knee. Even with his hand in such a state, he never released the grip on his sword, he only watched in silence as his spatial ring landed in Lionel's hand, the box that had stored the egg now no longer being in his possession. Amory didn't say a word as he rolled his finger over his sword domain heirloom. His figure flickered, vanishing into thin air. Lionel stood tall, his bow still roaring as twin white lions raced around him. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1390? Published at 21st of November 2022 9:47 and 9 seconds AM. Chapter 1390? Boredom. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1390 Boredom. Lionel's gaze remained impassive, shifting down to the bow in his hand before he shook his head. He didn't really feel any sense of accomplishment. He had wanted to defeat Amory with his spear, but that had ended up with his own being cut in half. Not to mention his spear, even his body had almost suffered such a fate. If not for his spear taking much of the edge off, he would have been in two halves right now. Of course, Lionel had progressed a lot. The first time he had fought Amory, the latter had his ability locked and he had dealt with several rounds of vital star force weighing him down. At the same time, Lionel was not only not weighed down by the star force, it even made him several times stronger. Even under those conditions he had lost handily. In this situation, though Lionel didn't quite know it, Bowman had a decided advantage in anarchic force-laced environments. It was for that reason that Cornelius was so shocked by Lionel's bow force earlier. Being able to use long-ranged attacks in a place where gathering atmospheric force was almost impossible gave one a huge leg up. In fact, it was only because the Rapak's nest was relatively lighter on anarchic force in the first place that Amory's sword force was able to travel so far. But even then, it weakened too much before it could slice Lionel in half. None of this even mentioned the fact that Lionel had no ability to use his enlightened bow force so many times in a row without the support of this quasi-life grade bow. Even if he hadn't been teaching Amory a lesson and he went directly for the kill, Lionel believed that he would have still needed at least 5 arrows to claim Amory's life. Under normal conditions, Lionel could shoot 2, and if he realized pushed himself into a comatose state, 3. After his mind broke into the 6th dimension he could barely shoot 4 now. Unfortunately, since his body had yet to catch up, his breakthrough into the 6th dimension didn't give as large a boost as it might otherwise. Regardless, it would leave him one short of victory. Plus, none of this even mentioned what advantages just shooting with this bow alone gave. It was subtle, but Lionel felt that it had had a suppressive effect on Amory's sword force, likely something related to abilities of the bow he had no right to use just yet. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. To experience faster update speed. All of this made Lionel incredibly unsatisfied with this victory. If he had wanted to win like this, he could have done it ages ago. This true selection would have been a joke if he used his bow from the beginning. Lionel suddenly felt a dull thud thump against his chest. Looking down, he found Aina standing before him, a slightly annoyed look on her face. "Less than 4 years?" she suddenly said. "Huh. The metamorphosis happened less than 4 years ago and he's been training since he was a toddler. If he saw your face right now, he'd probably die of rage." Lionel raised an eyebrow before he eventually shook his head and chuckled. He never cared to compare himself to others. When he told Conan to stop placing his limitations onto himself, he had meant it. He didn't care how many more years of experience, backing and knowledge Amory had than him, he still felt like he should be able to win his own way. "You're also lazy." Lionel blinked, snapping out of his own thoughts to look at Aina again. "Don't look at me like that, right? You can easily lose yourself in your work, giving the illusion that you're hard-working, but you only like to focus on things that are interesting to you, or things that give you the thrill of deduction like finding out something new. But how often have you stripped things down to their bare bones and just swung a wooden spear 10,000 times in the same stance for days on end?" This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. Lionel opened his mouth to respond, but suddenly found that he had no answer. Was he really lazy? Now that he thought about it, the only reason he was so fascinated with force crafting, at least in the beginning, was because his dad had challenged him. And now, just like Aina said, he loved it because every craft was like a new challenge, a new puzzle to solve, a new world to jump into. She was right, he had never really gotten to the nuts and bolts of things. Aina sighed seeing Lionel's expression. She remembered that at first she didn't want Lionel to follow her because she cared about him and thought that his talent might not be great enough to stay by her side, not until she got her revenge anyway. But almost instantly, he had flipped that thought of hers on its head. He seemed to improve all the time with hardly any effort at all. It was hard to tell someone like that they should be better and do better, especially when it worked so well. Lionel had an embarrassment of riches, but eventually the wellspring would come to an end. Eventually a quasi-life grade bow wouldn't be enough. Eventually he wouldn't be able to travel any further in spear domain. Eventually he would have to travel to places he couldn't survive in with the segmented cube. And then what? Would he hope another rage-fueled tantrum would push him over the edge and give him the strength he needed? If you want to be a king, you should learn how to deal with boredom. Or else, when that peace you want finally comes, what are you going to do with yourself? Aina looked at Lionel seriously when she spoke these words. It was just a few short and simple sentences, and yet it hit Lionel like a truck. She was right. When all the excitement was gone, what would he do? Chapter 1391. Published at 21st of November 2022 9:47 and 6 seconds AM. Chapter 1391. Really? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1391. Really? Lionel fell into silence, his palm flipping to return the bow to the segmented cube. He didn't quite have an answer. He never really thought about it. Even when he was with Aina, he never really thought about what their future together would look like. He didn't think about marriage, he didn't think about kids or grandkids, he never really imagined them growing old together either. It was odd that he never did. A man like him who was logical to a fault should have been thinking about those things. And, at the very least, he should have talked to Aina about it at some point. But he never brought it up. Do you want kids? Aina, who had been staring intently at Lionel, was suddenly caught completely off guard by the question. She was baffled in one moment before she went entirely red. What are you talking about all of a sudden? Seeing her reaction, Lionel laughed, all his worries seeming to float away. She could be quite bold sometimes, but she could also be adorably embarrassed just as easily. The ebbs and the flows of this were quite peaceful and relaxing. Maybe there was nothing wrong with some forms of boredom. No, really, Lionel said after he finally stopped laughing. Do you? Aina's eyes darted around. She couldn't believe Lionel had really chosen this kind of situation to ask this question. But, seeing that the answer was important to him, she bit her lip and nodded. How many? Lionel pressed. Aina was exasperated. What was wrong with this man all of a sudden? 10, huh? Lionel leaned in. Even with his hearing, Aina had spoken so softly that he couldn't hear exactly what she was saying. Was this really something to be so embarrassed about? As confusing as he was, this woman was even more confusing. She didn't even blink an eye when they got caught making out in the middle of a rapak's nest. Now she wanted to be all flustered? This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net, if you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed, at least 10, alright? Aina snapped, her voice practically blowing Lionel's hair back. At least 10? Lionel's brows rose. Does that mean you want more than that? Yes. Aina placed her hands on her hips. Is there a problem? I'm doing most of the work anyway. Lionel blinked. It seemed that this was more important to Aina than he knew, to think that he hadn't even thought to ask before. She even seemed a bit defensive about it, as though she was afraid that Lionel would say no. Even without going down that path, Lionel could tell that saying no would really hurt Aina, maybe even more so than those cruel words he had spoken that day on planet Montex. He could even feel the anxiety within her as she waited for him to respond. Lionel felt that he should have been able to guess this long ago. It was one thing for Aina to get super defensive and anxious over her experience with the puppet master back when her psyche still wasn't completely whole. But, for that to bleed over into her rage for the Steel Beast Master as well long after her mind had been repaired was a different matter entirely. What did both variant invalids have in common? Well, both them wanted to use her as some sort of sow to pump out babies for them. Maybe the reason Aina was so enraged went beyond them just crossing boundaries any woman would have up, but rather because they were also perverting something she held close to her heart and cherished. Lionel smiled. What are you so worried about? Like you said, you're doing most of the work anyway. How about we start now? Lionel's smile spread into a wild grin. 1 baby, 10 babies, 20? He didn't really care one way or another. Aina sighed a breath of relief before she rolled her eyes. I'm ignoring you. She turned away and began to walk to who knows where. How can you ignore me? If we don't start now, how are we supposed to get to 20? Think of the gestation period. Aina's lips arched in a smile Lionel couldn't see as she continued to walk away. The relief in her eyes almost seemed palpable. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net, be serious, we need to find a way out of here. Aina stopped by where the green runed egg had been, waiting for Lionel to put it down so that they could go. She knew Lionel well enough to know that he no longer had any intention of taking the egg with him. I can think of a few ways, Lionel spoke as he took out the box once again. No need to take it too seriously. Getting out of here probably isn't all that difficult anymore. Just look at all the energy around us. Really? Aina raised an eyebrow. Really? Aina was a bit skeptical, but she didn't think he would joke about something like this. Look at you doubting me. How could you doubt your future baby daddy? You don't say it like that. I physically cringe. What, baby daddy? That struck a nerve? I'm going to slot that in with things you get wrong like putting cereal in first. You're a terrorist to society, Aina snapped back. This terrorist would like to book a baby-making appointment. Really, if we don't start now, it'll be too late. I suddenly regret telling you this. It's real though. I hear having babies is harder at higher dimensions. The earlier we start, the better. Maybe for other women but not for me. I can have a baby whenever I want. Lionel's brows shot up. He was going to ask Aina what she meant by that, but his senses caused him to turn his head instead, only to lock eyes with a young man. The two had apparently completely forgotten that there were others around them. That bow. Lionel didn't need to hear the rest for his gaze to narrow. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1392. Published at 21st of November 2022 9:47 and 5 seconds AM. Chapter 1392. You're not. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The young man wasn't a person that Lionel had interacted with before. He had an unassuming build, but his gaze was extraordinarily sharp, sharper than any Lionel had ever seen before. Among the youths here, he was one of the very few who didn't have a single scratch on him despite the sheer violence and carnage of the previous battle. There was no doubt that this person was highly skilled, extraordinarily so. From what Lionel could tell, this young man was also a person of very few words. The stronger his king's might and dream force became, not to mention his soul, the better he was at reading people. For this young man to come out and say something, it was definitely something that was very important, at least to him. That bow, the young man repeated, seemingly not perturbed by Lionel's silence. How is it in your possession? Lionel observed this young man for a while longer. The silence didn't seem to make either man very awkward at all. Lionel continued to stare and the young man continued to remain silent, waiting for the response he wanted. My mother gave it to me, Lionel finally said. The shock of Lionel's victory against Amory was still hanging thickly in the air. Many didn't quite know what to do moving forward, their minds stuck in limbo. On one hand, the prize they had all rushed forward for was now already in Lionel's hands, and he had also more than proved his strength. On the other, there wasn't an easy way to leave this place and many still didn't know how to wrap their heads around exactly what had just happened before them. For those who knew Amory, they understood him to be a real deity within their generation. If they wanted a chance to catch up to him, they needed to step into the sixth dimension because it was the only way to bridge the advantage given by the sword domain heirloom. Simply put, Amory gained a head start on his god path, touching upon it much earlier than one should thanks to the insights granted by the sword domain. There was no use in getting jealous over it. After all, to be able to earn that sword domain heirloom in that family of monsters to begin with was a feat all to itself. However, to see that legend in their eyes fall and so easily at that, they found it difficult to wrap their heads around. This chapter upload first at novel.bin.net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit novelnext.com to experience faster update speed, but this young man seemed to have shocked them awake. That was right. The bow. That bow was at least of the quasi-life grade. In fact, it felt stronger than even others of that caliber they had seen. The fact that Lionel even had it in his possession was shocking enough, but the fact he could actually wield it, the young man's gaze narrowed when he heard Lionel's answer. That bow shouldn't be in the hands of a Morales family member. In fact, it shouldn't be in the hands of anyone not of our families. But somehow it has acknowledged you. This does not make sense. The young man knew how finicky this bow was. Most couldn't even lift it up, let alone pull its bowstring. It was like the bow had made the conscious decision to lower itself to Lionel's level, just so that it could help him. It didn't make any sense at all. In fact, it would cause a major uproar if these matters were known about to the Void Palace. No. It would cause a major uproar when these matters were found out. So, what do you want me to do about this exactly? Lionel asked. He wanted to understand what this young man's goal was exactly. My name is Nazag Terius. I tell you this so you know I am not a coward, but also for you to understand that I'm also far more reasonable than most. If a member of my alliance were to see you with this bow, their first assumption won't be that you claimed it for yourself, their first assumption would be your father has something to do with it. You aren't the first genius bowman in the Void Palace's history, and you aren't the only one of this generation either. Nazag's aura flourished, the piercing howl of enlightened bow force roaring through the surroundings. Lionel's gaze narrowed, but he didn't say a word, waiting for Nazag to finish. If I find out that your father has tampered with the White Lion bow and suppressed its will just so that you can use it to bully those of your own generation, not only I, but the whole of the Constellation Bow Alliance will declare war on the Morales family. This chapter upload first at novel.bin.net. Wife. Your hubby has returned. Velasco's voice boomed across the Void Palace, causing its mountains to quake and the youths to his back to cover their ears. Somewhere deep within the Void Palace, there was one gorgeous woman who rolled her eyes, but outside of her, there were several others that began to scramble. The arrival of Velasco Morales wasn't something any of them took lightly. You kiddos stay here, I have something to take care of. Velasco flashed a smile and his figure vanished, leaving the youths who were still in a daze from their near-death experience alone. When he appeared once more, he was already on the highest peak, his hands in his pockets and his feet suspended in the air. One would have thought that he was the perfect picture of Lionel if not for the fact that unlike his son, Velasco was enamored with dressing as immaculately as possible. Everything on him was prim, proper and trimmed, down to even his individual hair strands. "Rosen, why don't you come out here for a chat?" By this point, the head of the unfettered Blade Party had already stepped out. His head tilted up into the skies, his jaw steeled. "Velasco, don't do any." Val pointed a finger down and as though commanded by a deity, Rosen's right arm began to crumble to ash, vanishing into the wind piece by piece. Just like that, before the eyes of everyone, a mighty swordsman was crippled. "You family should think a bit more before they act this time. Luckily for you, this failure and your arm are enough to calm me for now." Velasco looked away from Rosen, whose forehead was pulsing with veins and face was dripping with sweat. I've used too much power with this avatar, it's already about to fade away. Wife, wait for me, I am coming." With a step he vanished. Chapter 1393. Published at 21st of November 2022 9:47 and 3 seconds AM. Chapter 1393. Don't worry if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The weight of Nazag's words were exceptionally heavy, so heavy in fact, that those who truly understood what the ramifications of such a thing would be were left frozen in silence. A war between the Morales and Constellation Bow alliance wouldn't just throw the human domain into turmoil, it would be a near-extinction level event. With two powerhouses on that level fighting it out, the idea of protecting the rest of the human race would become nothing more than a joke. Before the dust even settled, maybe half the human domain would be embroiled in this war while the other half would simply be too weak to have participated in the first place. The fact that Nazag could spear these words, though, meant a few things. Firstly, there was no doubt that his standing was high, exceptionally so. Even if it was just a guess on his part based on the importance of the bow to the alliance, there were certain things that people without a certain amount of power wouldn't dare to say. If Nazag held no power, it would be like a homeless man of ancient America declaring that they would lay siege to ancient Russia. It might be true depending on the context, but what place did a homeless man have to speak of such things? If anyone was going to make the decision, it would be the president or someone of high military rank. And that led to the second thing. His bow was far more important than Lionel knew. It could be said that his mother had dropped a hot potato in his lap. Truthfully, though, Eleanor hadn't been expecting Lionel to gain acknowledgement of the bow. She had only heard from her father that her little lion was a bowman, so she snatched the best bow she could find, expecting Lionel to grow into it eventually. She could have never expected that there wouldn't even be a barrier of entry. Like this, Nazag's assumption was quite cogent from his perspective. Lionel, indeed, wasn't the only genius to have ever existed, and while his Scarlet Star force was impressive, none of that was related to bowmanship. None of these people here had any way of knowing how early on Lionel had grasped bow force, and they were even more in the dark about the fact Lionel would have grasped enlightened bow force even faster if he had been aware that there were higher levels to strive for. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. To experience faster update speed. It had to be remembered that Lionel originally refused to ask the dictionary about progressing his spearmanship because he wanted to organically progress and improve. He didn't want his decisions to be jaded or influenced by those that came before him. Ultimately, this method had worked out excellently for Lionel as he finally managed to find a method to fuse his intuition with his analytical ability in combat. But the downside was that he was left in the dark about many things until it was later than one might expect. In the end, Lionel had actually ended up only learning of natural spear force and enlightened bow force after entering the fifth dimension, the latter coming later than the former because it was the catalyst that made Lionel realize there was something beyond. With things laid out like this, it was hard to see exactly how Lionel separated himself from other geniuses. Or, more accurately, exactly how he was supposedly a better fit for the White Lion bow than anyone else that had tried to gain its favor. In Nazag's mind, with the information he had on hand, the most likely series of events was that Lionel's father, known for his extraordinary abilities as a force crafter, tampered with the bow to allow Lionel to use it. To those of Nazag's ilk, this was worse than a slap in the face. If Velasco had done such a thing, he might as well have pulled his pants down and pissed into their mouths. It was that foul of a mark on their history. Now, Lionel had suddenly ended up in the middle of not just one, but two sweeping storms. On one side there was the Constellation Bow Alliance and on the other, there was the Sweard family. In the middle, there was the Morales family, and much of its current problems seemed to be Lionel's fault. It was then, amidst all the tension, that Lionel suddenly chuckled. His head turned back and looked toward Aina. "It seems I'm being underestimated again." Aina shook her head. Blame yourself. Who asked you to try and act cool? This chapter upload first at novel bin. Net, about that baby making appointment? Can you be serious? Lionel laughed, his hand reaching for the box and opening the lid. With a thought, he reached in and pulled out the egg, placing it back down where it had been and giving it a small pat. Just sitting there, the little guy was even taller than him. Lionel believed he even felt a little kick just now, causing his lips to curl into a smile. Stay in this egg for a little while longer, your race is much cuter like this. Lionel suddenly felt a hit to his waist. How could you say that to a baby? Did you want to serve this baby up on a platter a few hours ago? So did you. Lionel cleared his throat. Don't worry, even if our baby is ugly, he'll still love them just the same. Watching the two banter as though there was no one around at all, many weren't very certain of how they should be feeling. Did he just ignore the threat? What was happening here exactly? You all, Lionel looked up, having had his fill of teasing Aina. He'll be leaving this egg here, but that also isn't licensed to take it. I'm going to begin drawing a teleportation formation out of here now. If you'd like to live, then you should probably forget your greed. Lionel spoke these words and then began to do as he said, his mind already becoming focused enough to forget everything else. Chapter 1394. Published at 21st of November 2022 9:47 and 1 second AM. Chapter 1394. Grinded to dust. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel ignored everything else around him, the pressure suddenly becoming stifling for reasons most couldn't understand. In recent times, Lionel had mostly learned how to control the leaking of his aura when he focused thanks to fully awakening his King's Might lineage factor, but he couldn't be bothered to do so this time. The level of focus he needed was much deeper now than maybe it had ever been. Trying to draw a teleportation array fit for a seventh-dimensional world was already beyond much of what Lionel should have been able to do. To try and draw one while also surrounded by dense anarchic force was another massive hassle. To make matters worse, even though they were technically surrounded by a large amount of energy currently, energy that could most definitely be used to fuel such a thing, this energy was in the form of life force and not spatial force, making the task even more difficult. This meant that Lionel not only needed a focused form of mass teleportation, he also needed it to be able to convert force toward another use case. In the dimensional verse, using one form of energy as another was nigh impossible. Like Wise Star Order had said, these forces, especially at these high levels, practically had personalities of their own. To try and fit them into a box they weren't meant to fit in was basically impossible. However, there was good news too. For one, this was life force, not something unruly like Lionel's Scarlet Star Force. In addition, it was designed to be absorbed by babies. Granted, the Raypaks weren't exactly coddling of their young, not in the normal sense anyway. But a baby was a baby, simply put. Compared to other seventh-dimensional forces Lionel could try to take control of, this would be the simplest. And that led to the second advantage Lionel had, visualization. It had to be remembered that the fifth dimension was all about unchaining the mind and removing mental limits on the body to unleash its true and full potential. In order to do this, techniques used visualizations and certain artistic conceptions as exercises of the mind, helping those that used it to strengthen and fortify their minds, thus facilitating its unshackling. Despite this being the case, Lionel had hardly relied on it all during his breakthroughs. This was because he had another method of releasing the shackles of his mind, and that was his true state innate node. Visualizing and comprehending his Scarlet Star Force was not only just as good, but in Lionel's use case, it was even better than relying on any other technique. This was because his innate node was perfectly tailored to him, more perfectly tailored than any other technique could possibly be. However, despite this being the case, this didn't mean that Lionel had ever stopped comprehending the third stage because only by comprehending it fully like he had done with the second stage could he pass it on to those around him. It was a difficult and long drawn-out process. Even with his computing powers, closing in those final gaps for Lionel was almost too difficult. But he luckily had 3 breakthroughs. The first was his ability index suddenly gaining a huge boost thanks to something his father had apparently done. The second was his Luxnix family lineage factor reaching perfection and allowing his mind to enter the 6th dimension. And the final breakthrough was him entering Tier 6. Lionel had still yet to fully comprehend this third stage, but he had gained a small inkling that had inspired him. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. To experience faster update speed. How was it that the formation of his stars could cause so much atmospheric Scarlet Star Force to surge toward him? It could be said that if not for this benefit, this battle would have been far harder on Lionel. Of course, It only lasted a small time and eventually ran out, but if Lionel could trigger this more often without having to form a star, wouldn't he essentially gain the ability to use his Scarlet Star Force without any of the drawbacks? Lionel was certain that if he hadn't run out of Scarlet Star Force, his spear would have been enough to beat Amory. Of course, that would have not been much different from using his bow anyway, but the point still stood. This aside, Lionel's thoughts were simple. He couldn't catalyze such a large surge of force without much input like seemed to be able to do. But what he could do was use a large amount of force as a catalyst to bring in the force he wanted. Just like that, he could exchange all this 7th-dimensional life force around them for 7th-dimensional spatial force. Then, he could reverse engineer the teleportation path they took to get here to send them all back in the proper direction. Easy? Easy. Lionel's body flickered around the cavern, the force art beneath him growing more and more complex as he wielded the half that remained of his spear. It took several hours and he even had to pause several times, but he was soon close to finishing. Unfortunately, it was exactly at that time that the cavern rumbled. Lionel's gaze shot up, his jaw steeling. Aina. Aina appeared to his side without hesitation. Lionel swept a gaze around. If you all want to live, I would advise that you hurry up. If you don't, feel free to stay here and die. The sudden rumbling seemed to cause the prideful geniuses to forget themselves for a moment. One tried to take advantage of the commotion to swipe the egg, but they ended up with an arrow between the eye before Lionel could even do anything. Nazag lowered his bow in silence, not bothering to look in Lionel's direction. As for Lionel, he didn't have time to guess at or understand Nazag's motives. Maybe it was just his way of saying he didn't owe Lionel any favors anymore. Regardless, he didn't care. Lionel finished the final stroke as the youths of the Void Palace surged in. A wild green glow overwhelmed everything, blinding most. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. Lionel squinted, his brows furrowed tightly. He had created this array on the fly using a force art system he wasn't even used to. He hadn't been able to optimize things the way he would like. It was still possible for them to be stopped. If that happened, things would get more than just a little troublesome. 70%. 80%. 90%. At that moment, the ceiling was crashed through once again, a horde of Raypaks appearing. The lights had grown so bright that Lionel could hardly see what was happening beyond the bounds of the formation anymore. But he could just barely make out a ruined Raypaks cocking their arm back. Shit. Lionel's jaw steeled. Anything thrown by a 7th-dimensional existence was bound to be endlessly powerful. If it landed on the formation lines or had enough force to disrupt the natural flow, they were screwed. The latter was far less likely since the vastness and quantity of force Lionel had used was too much. But as for the former, 97%. 98%. 99%. A beam of light that looked like black lightning shot through the skies. It was so dense in its blackness that all the light around it seemed to vanish. The beam swerved, shooting up until it was right above Lionel's head and then barreling downward with an impossible-to-track speed. 100% boom. A roar of pain resounded. Lionel? Aina, despite her head and vision swimming, rushed to Lionel's side. At that moment, Lionel was pinned to the ground, an odd rod lying horizontally across his palm and shattering the gray land around him. Lionel's entire body was driven into the ground. His shoulder was dislocated, his knee was shattered, and every bone in his hand had been grinded to dust. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1395. Published at 21st of November 2022 9:46 and 59 seconds AM. Chapter 1395. LT felt like. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again, son of a bitch. Lionel had never experienced so much pain in his life. He had had almost all the bones in his body broken before, suffered runes being etched directly onto his bone, he had even almost been cut in half just hours ago. But somehow this was worse than all of it. The group had managed to complete the teleportation thanks to the fact that this black rod hadn't fallen onto the ground until just a split moment after they teleported. As a result of this, the rod managed to enter the range of the teleportation and was taken along, thus ending in the current situation. Beads of sweat fell from Lionel's brow. Come on, come on, come on. Lionel could vaguely feel that Aina was trying to help him, but this rod was way too heavy, it was denser than anything Lionel had ever felt before. Despite being only a small bit longer than a usual polearm, its weight was unfathomable. It was to the point Lionel was more so shocked that his hand hadn't been directly severed instead. For the first time he lamented his sturdy skin. That result would have most definitely hurt less than this. The only way out of this situation was to send this rod into a snow globe. But the problem was that in order to accomplish this, he had to envelop it with his internal sight. However, not only was this rod seemingly resisting his internal sight, it was hard to focus at all with this much pain racking his body. Fuck. Listen to me. Lionel roared at the rod. But it didn't seem to matter. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. To experience faster update speed, Lionel thought of just pulling his hand away, allowing his fingers to be severed. But he knew that he couldn't allow such a thing to happen. Although it would make the pain go away, he wasn't sure how recovery would work after that. The pain here was clearly originating from how much superior this rod was in comparison to him. An injury from a higher dimensional being, existence or object tended to scale accordingly. Lionel couldn't even focus enough to see what level this rod was at, but he knew that it was at least well into the gold grade. The only thing keeping him sane was the thought that whichever bastard Raypax threw this thing at him after he helped save their little baby king was probably lamenting their poor choice. If he ever met that guy, he would definitely use this same rod to bash its head in. Come on. Lionel failed to envelop the rod again. I've tried one too many times, I need to try something else. If he was in the right headspace, Lionel would have given up on this endeavor after the first failure. The definition of insanity was repeating the same action over and over, knowing it would fail. Lionel had realized that he would never be able to envelop this rod with his current level of internal sight. He didn't know why, and he had never run into such a problem before, but there was no denying it. He needed a different approach. His opposite palm flipped over to reveal the white lion bow once again. His thought process was simple. He hoped that it would be able to suppress the rod enough to allow him to do what he needed to do. It was a wild thought, quite frankly. He had never thought of doing such a thing before, but he assumed that if weapons could eventually grow to have personalities of their own, then this wasn't too far-fetched. This was especially so since he could subconsciously feel that this rod was fighting back against him. It was similar to his duality spear when he first claimed it. It hadn't wanted to listen to anything he wanted to say and refused to allow him to use its domain as well. It was clear that some weapons had their own sort of pulls and preferences, even if it wasn't as exaggerated as having a real soul. However, what happened when Lionel brought the bow shocked him. The good news was that whichever Raypax threw this weapon was definitely kicking themselves, absolutely furious that they had lost such a weapon. In addition to that, it seemed that Lionel was right, weapons could suppress one another after reaching a certain level. The bad news? Well, it wasn't the bow doing the suppressing. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. What the hell? Lionel really didn't know what to do at this point. Would he really have to sever his hands? It would be a huge issue. He would have to restart his designation from scratch, and that was only if he was lucky enough to regrow them or reattach them. He was beginning to feel that he was getting a raw deal. What kind of idiot just throws a life-grade weapon like that? A seventh-dimensional being's ability to calculate should be beyond even Lionel's. It should have known it wouldn't make it. Or, at the very least, it shouldn't have made its rod divert at the last minute like it had just for the sake of targeting him. Now he was in this mess. God damn it, you annoying brat, listen. Lionel, who had practically cut off everything around him to deal with this situation, finally heard Wise Star Order's voice ringing in his head. Well, it was actually ringing in his soul. The old bastard had really gone the extra mile. What? It's not a spear, you idiot. A spear you can touch without it disintegrating beneath the presence of the spear domain. Put it in the damn ring. What? Lionel looked again. He was absolutely certain it was a rod or a staff. It was a dense black, perfectly smooth, not the slightest blemish, all while warping the space around it just the smallest bit. There was no blade to be seen anywhere. However, now that Wise Star Order said it, it really felt like a spear. Lionel didn't hesitate, acting immediately. And the relief was almost instantaneous. He fell over, gasping for breath. Unfortunately, the reprieve didn't last for long. The commotion around him, the very same he had ignored until now, wasn't small in the slightest. Chapter 1396. Published at 21st of November 2022 9:46 and 58 seconds AM. Chapter 1396. Injured patient. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel lay on the ground, the pain coming in waves, but still much less than before. His hand was practically just a mangled ball of flesh, his shoulder still hadn't been pushed back into his socket, and after the initial pain subsided, he finally noticed that he had shattered his kneecap when he was driven into the ground. Luckily, it was only one shattered knee. but that just left an entire side of his body practically useless. And yet, right this moment there seemed to be a battle? Lionel's gaze squinted as he finally took in the surroundings. The landscape was just as bland as everywhere else, albeit rockier than usual. The region looked like it was covered in sand dunes, but these dunes were just small hills of hard rock. When Lionel's internal sight cleared, finally recovering from the beating the supposed rod spear had given him, he frowned. He had thought that they had somehow stumbled into enemy territory, but there weren't any enemies around at all. In fact, the ones fighting were Aina and the other geniuses, amongst themselves. Lionel frowned, trying to stand, but he felt over before he could. He actually felt so weak. To make matters worse, every time he moved, the rattling bone left in his hand and leg sent more sharp spikes of pain through him. Still, this was good news for Lionel. If his bone had truly been grounded to powder, he might as well just chop it off now and find a different method to regrow it. But, if they were in shards like this, he had a chance of making a full recovery. Of course, it would require a lot more pain, but it would be a worthwhile exchange. Right then, a dagger landed right beside Lionel, missing him by a hair's breadth. His brows furrowed. Just then, someone had aimed at him, but Aina's axe had deflected it from its path. Were they aiming after him? Lionel's expression darkened. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net, if you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. To experience faster update speed. This region should be in or very near human territory, that much Lionel was certain of. They were maybe a journey of a few hours away from the Void Palace at worst. This much was confirmed by the fact everyone's golden glows seemed to be back. Likewise, his purple glow was very much back as well. Seems I chose a terrible time to get injured. What happened here, old man? You collapsed, your little girlfriend ran to your side, but some saw this as a potential chance. Most have already left, using their tokens to orient themselves toward the Void Palace. But those that have stayed probably want your head. How fantastic, Lionel replied dryly. Ungrateful didn't even begin to describe it. His gaze scanned those that remained. There were 5 of them, all of which Aina was fighting alone. Lionel could tell that she was absolutely furious. Don't worry about me. Lionel's voice called out. Aina's ear twitched, but that seemed to be all she needed to hear. Her aura flourished and her hair whipped back. Lionel watched silently and without much of a word. The individual of greatest note here was Rowan Cancer, the very same young man that had sneak attacked Lionel when he first put up his amethyst token for competition. It seemed that he was very much eager to lay his hands on one for whatever reason. Aina's axe took one of their arms. A limb flew through the air, taking a spurt of blood with it. Aina reached a hand out and almost immediately, a harsh scream followed. No! The young man was sucked dry, becoming a mummified corpse before the horrified gazes of his allies. Rowan dashed forward, using the opening this created to attack Aina from the back. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. Aina's palm flared outward, the large orb of blood she had just procured becoming as a sheet of paper and wrapping around to her back. Its speed was sublime, surpassing anything human legs at this level could possibly match. Clang. Rowan was sent reeling backward and was soon faced with a wall of crimson spikes chasing after him as Aina actually chose to take a strong step forward, severing the heads of 2 more youths and adding to her bloody concoction. Seeing that the situation was bad, Rowan's gaze flickered as he continued to retreat, looking toward Lionel. But all he found in return was a gaze that was somehow both cold and dull. Despite the fact Lionel was just sitting there, clearly heavily injured, Rowan felt a cold chill crawl up his spine. There was a large problem as well. Even if he killed Lionel, he would have to face Aina's wrath, and he wasn't willing to get entangled into such a battle right now. Thinking to this point, he turned on his heels and sprinted away, his straight-line speed making him look like a black line racing across the rocky dunes. Lionel didn't do anything as Rowan ran away, not that he could do much of anything. He was entirely focused on at least trying to get his right leg working. Unfortunately, he had already used his, and even though he could now use it once a day, it hadn't been 24 hours yet. Plus, while it would work on his knee and shoulder, he was certain that it wouldn't work on his hand. After all, the snowy star owl was a 6th-dimensional creature while that rod was of the life grade. They weren't comparable at all. Aina slaughtered the final 2, her expression still fuming. While it softened a bit when she returned to Lionel's side, it was clear she was pissed. Not only had Lionel been attacked after saving all of them, no one had even bothered to help out of gratitude. It was as though they were doing them a favor by not getting involved. Lionel chuckled as he hopped up to 1 foot, unceremoniously leaning all of his weight on Aina and draping his uninjured arm over her shoulder. You're adorable when you're angry. Don't make me kick you away. Oh. Aina's head snapped toward Lionel, but when she realized he was pulling her leg, she pinched his hip hard. I'm an injured patient here. Then act like one. Aina supported Lionel's weight without the slightest issue, and the two began to walk back toward the human domain, their banter becoming probably the only laughter in the whole of the void battlefield. Chapter 1397. Published at 21st of November 2022 9:46 and 56 seconds AM. Chapter 1397. Very, very scared. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The trek back was long but not particularly arduous. If it wasn't for the dense anarchic force in the air, it would have been quite a simple hike. With Aina's strength, even if Lionel was 100 times heavier, it would have hardly made a difference. If it wasn't for the difference in their sizes, she could have just lifted him up and over her shoulder. With Lionel's teasing, she was almost tempted to do it anyway. But she eventually decided that she would give him some leeway. Lionel, though, was greatly fascinated with Aina's blood force. Even now, he couldn't really understand how it worked. It seemed to both be a really sharp weapon and simultaneously a powerful shield as well. And that was only when Aina didn't consume it. Lionel knew that Aina could benefit greatly from blood. He still remembered her absorbing his own blood through her fingers. The result of that was her curse being burnt away and her true appearance being locked into frame. Still, it seemed odd. What was it about blood that could make it such a powerful tool? The answer seemed obvious enough. Blood carried much of what we were. But that was mostly the answer of someone obsessed with talks of bloodlines and lineages. The reality was that every piece of a human's body, so long as it contained a cell, carried just as much information about their genes and DNA as their blood did. Maybe the only reason blood became such a forefront of such talks was because it was among the easiest and less disgusting things to sample. You could just as easily get a full picture of someone's genes from their spit. This was how things were if you looked at them logically, anyway. But this left Lionel all the more fascinated. Aina's control over blood went beyond just manipulating it. She could absorb and assimilate it. In fact, if she absorbed enough of Lionel's blood, he wouldn't be surprised if she birthed a Scarlet Star Force affinity no worse than his own, much the same way she had taken all the strengths of the Abyss Panther of Terrain for herself as well. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed. Maybe those things are true for Earth and the third dimension, but blood represents much more in the dimensional verse. The simplest way I can describe it is that it's the conduit that life force resides in. Life force? So your blood force is that powerful because of life force? Then why the hassle then? Why not just use life force directly? That way you don't need to cut your enemies to make use of their blood. Aina shook her head. It doesn't work like that. Life force is like gasoline or electricity while blood is the engine that runs on it. Alone, gas and electricity, or most forms of that type of energy, are useless. It's only when they're applied across certain modes that they gain power. Blood is like a vehicle in driving and life force is the fuel. There's no better fuel than life force and there's no better vehicle for it than blood. If I use life force alone, I can only really apply it to my body and it becomes difficult to apply it to others. That's because unlike other forces which have universal signatures to them, the life force of everyone differs from one to another. Hopping between them is inadvisable and only someone skilled enough to make life force neutral could use it to heal someone other than themselves. It's similar to blood types in that way. Lionel was suddenly enlightened. If what Aina was saying was true, it was no wonder she was so powerful. Her life force affinity was exceptionally high. This would make her greatly in tune with her particular life signature, which would in turn lead to many of the abilities she seemed to have. At the same time, because her life force was so powerful, it made her blood force just as powerful. The end result would obviously be physical strength. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. It all seemed to tie together quite nicely and Lionel came to very solid understanding. So when you take the blood of an enemy, you're essentially taking their life force with it. Then you use their own force to fuel the strength of your blood manipulation. Aina nodded. It's also a bit more complicated than that as well. Life force is tied to your vitality and how long you can live as well. Because of that, when within the body, the responsibility of blood force is to regulate how much is used over time. That means that at any given time, the active life force within your blood is only a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of your total life force. When I rip someone's blood out of them, that regulation falls under my control. I essentially gain access to the total sum of a person's entire life's worth in an instant and can use it as quickly or slowly as I please. The more powerful the person, the more difficult it is to take their blood. But likewise the results are also far better. The power I can output with blood by my side is exponential. Theoretically, I don't really have a limit. It's just that I don't use it very often in battle because it feels like a cheat. I prefer to hone my foundational skills, knowing full well that when I want to, the power I can output easily tenfold or even many more times that stronger. Lionel chuckled. Should I be scared of you? Aina nodded eagerly. Very scared. Lionel laughed. He knew that his assessment of Aina wasn't off, and this explained a lot. Her base strength was one thing, but her power when multiplied by her blood force and life force affinities were on a completely different level. So how does this relate to you saying you could have a baby whenever you want? Lionel suddenly asked. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1398. Published at 21st of November 2022 9:46 and 54 seconds AM. Chapter 1398. Heartless. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Aina blushed slightly and looked away. Why was this man always asking her about embarrassing things? Lionel smirked. What? Is this related to your period? Lionel's words were cut off by an elbow to the gut. Damn, this woman was too strong for her own good, but maybe he deserved that a little bit. He didn't really think it was an embarrassing thing to talk about, honestly. All women had to deal with it, even those of higher dimensions. He just never really looked into it. Though now that he thought about it, he was quite clueless about Aina's cycle, something that didn't make much sense considering how long they had spent together. It had never really been a problem and he didn't notice any trends. In addition, he never really picked up on her discomfort or mood swings either, though the latter could be explained away by the fact Aina had practically been in a perpetual state of mood swings back then. But that wouldn't begin to explain the former. I don't have to worry about my period, especially recently. It's entirely in my control. I can decide when an egg is released, and when it isn't, it's not a problem. Usually, higher dimensional beings have trouble having children because their life expectancies increase, slowing down all of their biological functions. Whereas for someone in the third dimension, an egg would be released once every month. The higher you go up in dimension, the more erratic and dilated the timing becomes. Beyond there are extra added barriers to life, clashing high-level forces that make it difficult for some batches of sperm to fuse with an egg even if the egg really is there. In those cases, it becomes a matter of frequency and determination. But in most cases it's just a waiting game. Clashing high-level forces? Lionel asked. Yes. An egg and a sperm each have half their owner's DNA, but the resulting combination is completely random. The higher you are in dimension, the more force plays a role in this. Certain affinities, lineage factors, and even ability indexes can cause clashes. In fact, at those high levels, every variable matters. For example, the female or male's diet that month. At high levels, food also contains large influxes of force that can fundamentally change the chemical and hormone balance of the body and thus potentially ruin proper fertilization. It can become really complex very quickly, even down to the environment. So, rather than becoming easier as you grow more powerful, it actually becomes a lot more difficult. Aina seemed like she could continue for days talking about this topic. She was obviously not only well-versed, but she had dedicated a lot of time to understanding. It only reminded Lionel all the more how important it was to her. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit novelnext.com to experience faster update speed. Is by N. Uvel by N. At the same time, it also reminded Lionel that Aina was labeled a 5-star health professional for a reason. Made him think. The gene analysis exam of Earth was actually so accurate. What mechanisms were it built on? Was it really possible to guess what someone would be good at from their genes alone? If the answer was yes, it felt almost existential in the level of problems it could present. So you're able to control all of those factors, Lionel guessed. Yes. I can feel what food would be beneficial to me, I can choose which egg is released and when, I can fuel it in the most optimal way. Hold on a minute. Lionel's gaze narrowed. Doesn't that mean that a condom was completely unnecessary? Aina blinked, staring off into the distance before turning her head to look up into the skies. Well, would you look at that? She said cheerfully. What nice weather we're having today. Ah. Aina suddenly felt a greedy hand squeeze at her chest. Lionel had his arm draped over her shoulder for support, but now it seemed he wanted a little bit more. Aina jumped up and scurried away, letting Lionel fall. However, to her shock, he appeared by her side again. Your legs. They're already healed. Aina was part relieved, part betrayed, and another part amused. Lionel grinned. You're not getting away that easily. You heartless vixen, I want my emotions back. What emotions? Question mark. Heartache. Despair. And the king of them all, blue balls. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net follow current novels on N, Oval be in. Aina sputtered with laughter, her body suddenly becoming enveloped by a crimson aura. By now, Lionel knew that this meant that Aina was pouring more of her life force into her blood, increasing her physical attributes. She could basically exchange her life for a buff whenever she wanted. Of course, Lionel wasn't worried about her shaving years off like this because firstly, it wouldn't be so exaggerated, maybe days at best. And because Aina's life force affinity was so high, her lifespan was beyond what Lionel could imagine. On top of that, she could steal life force from others whenever she wanted. At that moment, she smiled sweetly, looking every bit as lovely as usual. But, for some reason, Lionel could almost see the devil horns and tail coming out of her. Your legs might be healed, but running with that arm would be quite the hassle, don't you think? Catch me if you can. Aina bolted into the distance, leaving a line of red and black in her wake. Lionel was left speechless. Where was the justice? What about his emotions? His blue balls? Lionel looked at his right hand, realizing her probably couldn't even enjoy sex with his arm like this. What a waste. With a thought, Lionel brought out some metals from the segmented cube, then formed them around his hand, locking everything in place so that the hurt to him was minimized to the extreme. Then, with a grin, his body lit up with a white gold glow. He didn't max out his speed branch for no reason. He shot off, leaving a blazing trail of gold in his wake. Illusory wings appeared to his back, making it feel as though he had been shot out of a cannon. The air imploded as he closed the distance by half in the blink of an eye. Unfortunately, Lionel's fun didn't last. Over the horizon, the tall gates of the human domain loomed. It seemed he would have to put his fun aside for now. Another win for the heartless vixen. Just 2 chapters today, back with 3 tomorrow. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1399. Published at 21st of November 2022 9:46 and 52 seconds AM. Chapter 1399. Relax, if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. I lied. Race number 3. As Lionel caught up with Aina, he slowed, eventually coming to a halt by her side. He smiled a bit, seeing that her cloak of gold had indeed become violet. Lionel knew that she was already close, so defeating those last 4 individuals should have put her way over the edge. If she took out her golden token now, it would most definitely be amethyst. Lionel looked down at his metal-encased arm. He didn't know what else this journey would have in store for him, but this would definitely be a problem. He could only sigh toward his bad luck. He had never really consciously trained his left hand and his right always took the lead. No, I should be able to if I... Alright, I'll name this dream mirror. Lionel closed his eyes for a moment, a focused aura concentrating around him. It took a few minutes and he even had to come to a stop, but when he opened his eyes again, the feeling of his left arm was completely different. It was almost as though he was looking through a mirror world. The control Lionel had over his body had definitely increased. Just now, he rewired his proprioception and reworked how he received signals from his nerves. He didn't physically change anything about his body, he only put the signals he received through a filter he built in his dream world. Dream Mirror allowed him to now use his left hand as though it was his right. It felt as though nothing had changed at all. Good. Lionel nodded to himself. Ready? Aina asked. She didn't bother to ask Lionel what he had just done, she assumed that if it was important, he'd say. If it wasn't so much, it was fine. Seeing her trusting expression, Lionel sighed inwardly. He knew he would have to tell her what he had tried to do with her father soon. He didn't feel right keeping it to himself. Aina. Chem? Lionel met Aina's gaze. The two ignored everything around them, even the slowly opening gates up ahead. Lionel bluntly explained everything, not leaving out any details. From start to finish, Aina didn't say a word. Even after he was done, she remained silent. Lionel didn't press her and simply waited. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net, if you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed, SS Novel BIN. You wanted the tablet? Yes. And you were willing to steal it? Yes. But you rejected me? Lionel blinked, a bit confused. Aina suddenly smiled. It was the kind of smile that froze Lionel in place, one he couldn't even properly react to. She was simply too beautiful. Even wearing beast skin clothing, something that should have made her primal and quite rough, she had an air of softness and a rare gentleness that left him in awe. You're quite the idiot, don't you think? Huh? Lionel responded absent-mindedly, unable to take his eyes off of her face. If you want to steal something from a woman's father, you just have to get her to steal it for you. What are you going to do without me? You can't even do the simplest of things without my guidance. Lionel was speechless. What was this woman saying? Come on, we still have work to do. Don't worry your handsome little head, he'll take the vanguard. Lionel found himself being pulled away by a strength he probably couldn't resist even if he wanted to. His brain was still trying to compute what he had just heard, but it felt as though the program kept returning errors. And then his eyes happened to land on Aina's swaying hips and the dimples on her back. Had those Venus dimples always been there? Maybe he had felt them with his hands before, but he had never actually seen them. It felt like two enchanting pair of eyes were looking back at him, swaying with the rhythm of her hips and ass. Damn, tokens. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net visit NOVO Bayan. For a better user experience, Lionel was snapped out of his daydream by the shout of guards. When he looked up, though, he found that their appearances were far more reserved than one might have expected. It was clear that their apprehension was rooted in the violet glow that surrounded both Lionel and Aina. Doing as they were told, the couple presented their tokens, and as expected, Aina's own had mutated. There was just a tinge of gold that separated it from Lionel's own. This was likely just confirmation that Aina had battled her way to earning her own. The apprehension was still quite muted though. The youths could probably hardly be considered youths any longer and they had seen their fair share of battle. Plus, reaching this step, Lionel and Aina could only be considered quadrant-ranked disciples while all of the students here were galaxy-ranked at worst. Their status could not be compared. However, whether that would last was a different matter entirely. There was something that Lionel had forgotten in his thought of the true selection being over. This was merely the gold token ranked selection. As for the amethyst token ranked, there's some god up there that hates me. Lionel looked toward Aina, suddenly understanding what she meant by take the vanguard. She literally meant that she would carry him the rest of the way. The duo had hardly stepped foot into the walled-off fort when a familiar woman appeared before them both. The human domain fort was unlike anything Lionel had ever seen before. The height of the walls were measured in kilometers, their thickness measured in hundreds of meters. They seemed to be all metal worked into a single sheet and he couldn't find a single seam anywhere. Maybe if it wasn't for the gloomy atmosphere they would be shining like stainless steel. The inner workings of the fort were a bit confusing. They seemed almost too simple compared to the walls. There were nothing but endless beast-skin military tents, with even the tallest only being barely 3 meters. There wasn't a hint of luxury in sight. The woman that appeared before both Lionel and Aina was, of course, Asena. Her expression was impossible to read even for Lionel himself. However, he had already been carefully observing this woman since she had a spat with his mother. You have 3 days. Failure in that time frame demotes your token and your only chance to become galaxy-ranked disciples in a single bound. She snapped her fingers and a formless pressure took hold of Lionel and Aina. When Lionel's vision cleared, he found himself in a world he couldn't make heads or tails of. What he could tell, though, was that aside from Aina, there was a third person by his side. Imri. Lionel sighed. The Void Palace was truly not a place that allowed you to relax. Chapter 1400. Published at 21st of November 2022 9:46 and 50 seconds AM. Chapter 1400. Which one? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel expressionlessly met Amory's gaze before his own shifted toward the latter's hand. Amory obviously hadn't had a chance to properly heal himself. His right hand was now useless to him and wrapped up in several bandages. The two of them were ironically the same in this facet. Amory didn't seem to react very much to the appearance of Lionel and Aina. It was clear that he had been expecting as much. The light in his eyes didn't seem to have faded at all despite his loss, being just as starry as they always were. Maybe the only difference between now and then was the fact he actually looked at Lionel this time. Both men looked away at the same time, observing their surroundings. Aina, who had been observing this scene, shook her head. Men, if you want to kill each other, just do it. There obviously wasn't a chance to do so now, so in that case, what was the point of the dick measuring contest continuing? Her lips curled into a smile despite her thoughts. Seeing Lionel act like this was adorable to her. Sometimes he seemed less than human, but it was things like this that grounded him a bit. She didn't know which was the real Lionel, and it somewhat worried her that he was only able to be this human at all because of the restraints his father had placed on him. However, what she did know was that no matter what the answer was, she wouldn't be changing her mind about whether or not to stay by his side or not. That much was already decided. Despite spending some time observing the world, Lionel couldn't pick out anything. There was nothing but an endless blackness in every direction. The only good news was that at least Asena wasn't just messing with him again. Since Amory was here as well, it meant that he didn't get a chance to rest either. Though there was a gap of few hours, that much could only be blamed on Lionel himself. "Welcome to Void Tower." The voice boomed, enveloping everything. Lionel's brow shot up. Would they actually get an explanation of what was going on this time? This was great. This must be what victims of Stockholm Syndrome feel like. Lionel shook his head. How ridiculous was it that he was getting excited for the bare minimum? As wielders of the Amethyst token, you will be allowed one free entry into the tower. Do not squander it. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed SS Novi, EL Binge. The voice vanished. Lionel was speechless. Was this supposed to be an explanation? Before he could think any more, a strong pressure enveloped him. Lionel realized at that point that letting Aina carry him was out of the question. It seemed that this would be a solo venture once again. Looking down at his right hand, he could only sigh. When Lionel's vision cleared, he found himself in a room filled with weapons. You have 10 minutes to pick your weapon of choice. Lionel looked down at himself, realizing that all of his accessories and spatial rings had vanished. He was stark naked, being stripped down entirely. Soon, though, his naked body was covered in a skin-tight black onesie that felt like a second skin. My metal arm is going to crumble without my conscience protecting it. Lionel frowned, realizing instantly that this wasn't his real body. But, to make things worse, the Void Palace wasn't nice enough to give him back use of his right arm. What the hell is the point of a virtual simulation if you're handicapping me anyway? Though Lionel was complaining, he understood why. This was an extension of the true selection. Of course they wouldn't be nice enough to let him heal. They wouldn't make things so convenient. The good news, though, was that this skin-tight suit was able to adjust based on Lionel's thoughts. He solidified the fabric around his hand and then caused extensions to grow so that his arm could sit in an arm sling. He rotated his right shoulder and nodded once it was secure. Now, his right arm was practically fused with his body. It wasn't going anywhere. What weapon do I pick? Lionel's brow furrowed. He couldn't use a bow with one arm. And, while he could get away with using a spear with one arm, it wasn't ideal. Now wasn't the time to suddenly start experimenting with new weapons. Lionel's gaze flashed. Since he was only getting one shot at this, there was only one right answer. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. Continue reading on Novel Bin. I guess the quarterback of the Royal Blues is going to make an appearance today. Time to bring the show to the wider dimensional verse. Lionel began to load himself up, his thoughts flickering and new weapon racks appearing again and again as though he was flipping through pages. No one had ever said he could only pick one weapon, right? Lionel had no idea that currently, outside the Void Tower, a large commotion was brewing. Every year at this time the spectacle was just the same. Seniors would gather to watch their amethyst token-wielding juniors either fall flat on their faces, or soar beyond their previous records. This year the number was fewer than they were used to, being just 3. But the spectacle was just the same. A large crowd accumulated at the bottom of the tall black tower, many of which were representatives from factions of various ranks. The atmosphere this time, though, was a bit odd. That was because just hours ago Velasco Morales had made an appearance, crippling the shared majority leader of the Void Senate. And now, rumors said his son was about to undertake his first Void Tower challenge. Velasco had long since vanished, but the commotion he stirred lit a blaze of fire beneath the Void Palace, causing even those that wouldn't normally come to such an event surge over. The crowd this year was easily 10 times larger than it had been in any other true selection era. And it was right then that 3 screens flickered to life. Almost instantly, a large wave of whistles rang out. Who's that beauty? We have another one for the list? Shut up and focus. Which one is Velasco's son? None of them have the Morales family's bronze hair, and I don't see anyone wielding a spear. It was obvious in the end that only Lionel could have been the one they were looking for. But, seeing his choice in weapon, or rather, weapons, their faces couldn't help but turn odd. In the crowd, though, 6 particular young men watched silently, waiting to see what their baby brother could do. More coming. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1401. Published at 21st of November 2022 9:46 and 47 seconds AM. Chapter 1401. Tortoise? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel looked like an artillery unit, if artillery units came with one arm in humanoid forms, that is. His entire body was strapped in countless daggers and needles. Just a cursory glance put the numbers well into the hundreds. They wrapped around his torso, his groin, his thighs, his calves, his ankles, even his neck. The only part of him that wasn't swamped was his left arm. As though this wasn't enough, 10 enormous javelin containers crashed into the ground, each easily over 3 meters tall and the javelins within them being even taller. This was enough to make the crowd raise an eyebrow, but it was like Lionel wasn't satisfied with making a fool of himself only this much. On the ground around him, several round shields lay. Is the littlest Nova of the Morales family a tortoise or something? The individual who spoke was a prominent member of the sword factions, clearly uncaring about offending the Morales family. Plus, with Velasco gone, what did he have to fear? A sputtering of laughter followed his comments. No matter how you looked at it, Lionel feared for his life so much that he had drowned himself in weapons he wouldn't even be able to use to their fullest potential. Cross-referencing his current appearance with all of the most successful individuals of the past, then seeing how each of Aina and Amory only had a single weapon each, it only made him look all the more pathetic. Amory wielded a single wooden sword just like he always did. Ain wielded a single battle axe with a polearm taller than even her own body. None of them even bothered to wear any armor. But then there was Lionel, who would have probably drowned his face in weapons if he got the chance to do so. You've missed the big picture, Alfin. Enlighten me. Just look at him. He's so flustered he can't even tell the difference between a spear and javelin. Tell me you think he thinks the more spears he has, the better he'll perform? The laughter of the sword faction bordered on exaggerated. It was as though they were venting all the stifling frustration Velasco had left them with. In just these few hours alone, the head-butting between the sword and spear factions was quickly reaching a fever pitch, and it only seemed to be getting worse. Unfortunately, the spear faction couldn't even say anything in rebuttal. They had no idea what Lionel was doing. What did a Morales need so many daggers and needles for? And could he really not tell the difference between a javelin and a spear? This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net, if you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed. The source of this content is Novel Bin. Com. Javelins were lighter, had smaller heads, and were designed to balance in the air. A true spearman should be able to tell the difference with a single touch. I think you've overestimated his intelligence, Sarad. If he thinks so many shields will help him, he's already a lost cause. Look at him, he hasn't even opened his eyes yet and the simulation is already about to begin. The laughter continued to ring, but in the skies, Cornelius stood with his arms crossed. His mind flashed with images he had seen just hours ago. Still, even he was a bit confused. What was Lionel trying to do here? Lionel's eyes remained closed, his mind entering a state of focus. Within this dream world, a perfect replica of his current state reflected in his mind. Then, one by one, the daggers, needles and knives dotting his body lifted up. Numbers began to fly about within Lionel's dream world, building a new dreamscape in the blink of an eye. Weight, balance, effective range, hardness, sharpness, even how well they accepted the flow of force, everything was labeled and organized. When Lionel's eyes opened, a deep sharpness split the space before them in two. At the very same instant, whether by coincidence or not, the growing peanut gallery surrounding the tower fell into silence. The world of deep fog around Lionel rumbled. Lionel didn't care if his right arm was useless. Today he'd be sure to ploy through. Lionel stepped on the shield before him. It was the only one that didn't have a round form. It was a tower shield probably designed for someone much taller than him. It was 1.5 meters wide and 3 meters tall. It had an intricate design and force art on its face, but it was ultimately just a fourth-dimensional product, as were all of Lionel's other shields as well. But that was exactly why he chose them. These shields weren't designed for protecting him. The moment Lionel's second foot stepped onto the shield, it rose high into the air, soaring 3 meters up in the blink of an eye. At the same time, the round shields scattered around him shot forward, scooping up the 10 javelin containers and raising them into the air as well. Lionel looked forward, feeling the rumbling of the first floor continue. And then they appeared. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net Novel Bin. They were hulking beasts, monstrosities that seemed to lumber and yet had speed that could rarely be matched within the fifth dimension. Chasm flame lions. They had manes of flickering black flames and claws that shimmered with silvery, starry lights. Even the smallest among them was 3 meters tall on all fours, the larger ones measuring in at 5. He got a beast horde on the first floor? Unlucky, Cornelius mumbled. The theme on the first floor was locked in from floors 1 to 9, with a boss waiting on the 10th. Beast hordes were often the most taxing to deal with and often became a huge stamina drain. The events of the Void Tower were random to stifle preparation. However, as a result, it was impossible to make everything perfectly fair. Let's see, Cornelius' words caught in his throat. Lionel didn't wait, his palms swiping at lightning speed and snatching 3 needles from his hip. He stepped hard on the tower's shield, a loud boom resounding as his left arms cocked back and his torso twisted explosively. Bang! The needles whistled through the air, a shockingly bright bow force following enveloping them. The first 3 chasm flame lions found their foreheads pierced through. One could follow with their line of sight the trail of the 3 needles. Everywhere they passed by within the body of the lions, a violent bulge would take place until all 3 exited with just as much fierceness. Bang! The 3 lions imploded into a rain of blood and gore. Lionel's fingers beckoned, causing the 3 needles to zip back even as he cocked his arm back once again. A slaughter had begun. Chapter 1402. Published at 21st of November 2022 9:46 and 46 seconds AM. Chapter 1402. All time if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel's sharp eyes seemed to pierce through everything. Every time he threw, 3 would die, his bow force leaving blazing trailed through the black and foggy skies. He soared through the skies, his javelin containers following in his wake. The chasm fire lions opened their mouths, sending beams of black fire shooting for Lionel. However, as though he couldn't see them at all. His right foot stepped forward, his left arm shooting forward once again. The needles whizzed by, bypassing the arc of flames that seemed to appear before Lionel in the blink of an eye. Lionel didn't elevate too high off the ground. The moment he tried to, he felt a strong pressure. It was clear that the void trials wouldn't allow him to just easily cheat his way to victory by plucking them off from above. In real life, just flying into the skies wouldn't be convenient. The air often had even more savage and primal enemies waiting. Due to this, it wasn't difficult in the slightest for him to be attacked. In fact, since he could only fly 3 meters up, his javelin containers seeming to be an exception as they could go much higher, it was still quite easy for even physical attacks to be launched at him. Bang! The beams of fire seemed to completely envelop Lionel. But, when the air cleared, the fire had suddenly shot into a single palm, forming a concentrated ball of fire in Lionel's hand. To try and play around with fire before him? It seemed that these lions overestimated themselves a bit too much. What Lionel didn't know was that his actions had shocked those on the outside. No matter how high your affinity, you shouldn't be able to so easily snatch force in the control of another being. And yet, Lionel had done it as though it was as simple as breathing. This was a hidden power of the mage core that Lionel hadn't realized was so abnormal. But very soon, the entire world would know that those with fire affinity should steer clear of the Morales family's littlest nova. His palm flared, the ball of fire splintering into a dozen controlled and concentrated javelins. Lionel's spear force and bow force surged. With a wave of his hands, the javelins shot forward, all 12 piercing into the body of the largest chasm fire lion. A roar of pain and horror resounded as the lion was suddenly enveloped by its own fire, its body incinerating from the inside out. In its final moments, it thrashed about, slapping some of the smaller lions to death. This chapter upload first at NovelBin.net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit NovelNext.com to experience faster update speed. New novel chapters are published on NovelBin. Lionel didn't even pay attention to the death of the lion. He was systematic and cold. He attacked once. His confidence was such that he didn't need to double-check. He crashed into the first line of charging beast, tilting the tower shield he was riding upward and slamming down hard. Bang! The head of the lion imploded, but Lionel had already brought out a dagger from his thigh, whipping it to the side. A lion whose mouth had opened wide to bite Lionel's head off found its throat greeted by a flying dagger laced with bow force. The dagger shot through the back of its skull as though it was butter, spiraling through the air and curving through the head of a second lion. At some unknown time, a needle had appeared between Lionel's teeth. His chest expanded, his eyes flashing as a belly full of air jetted out. A line of crimson flames and bow force followed, tearing a line through the lions that had tried to bear down on him from the front. 3 lions found themselves imploding one after another, their flesh as fragile as wet paper. Lionel's palm opened, his thrown dagger snapping back into place, only for another flick of his wrist to send it flying through another skull. Lionel's wrist throws weren't as powerful as his full body throw, but what was undeniable was the fact they still had their own powerful strength, and how could they not? A spearman without powerful wrists was a weak spearman. Barely several minutes had passed, but Lionel wiped the entirety of the first floor, standing unmoving. There were several leaderboards that lined the outside of the Void Palace. New records were divided into whether it was a first or later attempt. In addition, because of the randomness of the Void Tower, they were also divided into floor types. There were clear records for single floors and tiers. Tiers referred to groups of 10 floors, where Lionel was currently within the first. The Beast Horde leaderboard shifted. It was a list dominated by those who controlled large area of effect attacks and archers for obvious reasons. And yet, there was no clear on a first attempt faster than Lionel's own. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net visit myboxnovel.com to read please. However, this leaderboard only contained those who were currently disciples of the Void Palace. There was always a duplicate leaderboard for all-time measurements. However, it was very rare for this leaderboard to move. And even if there were movements, it would be deep into the hundreds upon a leaderboard that only displayed 1,000 to begin with. Today though, that changed. Top 100. No one here could remember the last time there had been a change that high. The surroundings had fallen silent for quite a while now, but it seemed even more all-encompassing than before. However, this shock only lasted for a moment before it was overwhelmed by another. The leaderboards moved again, but this time, it wasn't for the sake of Lionel. And then it shifted again once again, not for the sake of Lionel. Under the shocked gazes of those watching, the leaderboard for forest goblins and stone maze began to shift as well. Both Amory and Aina had set their own records. However, Aina's, being the only one of them without a single injury, set an eye-popping number none were quite ready for. Forest goblins, first attempt, all time. Chapter 1403. Published at 21st of November 2022 9:46 and 44 seconds AM. Chapter 1403. Efficiency. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The shock was palpable. The forest goblin floor was exceptionally difficult not only because of the strength of the enemies, but more importantly due to their stealth. Just finding the targets took time, let alone dealing with their assault once they were done. No one was sure how Aina did it. She seemed to just stumble onto her targets one after another, and even when most would have thought that the floor was cleared, she continued to attack and took out several more before finally putting down her axe. In the end, she was only 3 seconds away from surpassing the previously long-held record, and that was set by a person from a family so in tune with nature and greenery that the plants practically spoke to her. The idea that Aina would come even close to such a feat was baffling to the point of being difficult to accept. However, it felt like today would be a day the world lost its logic. Stone mace, first attempt, all time, 3 youths, 3 new records all set back to back to back. It was more than just a little difficult to accept, it bordered on ridiculous. When they had said that there was something special about this generation, the truth was that only the older generations had taken it seriously. The youths, however, snorted at the prospect. They had been on the front lines, slaving for the Void Palace every day. Why would they suddenly move to the side obediently so that these youths could take their spot? In truth, most of them had just directly ignored the rumors. They felt that once their juniors stepped foot in this place, they would quickly learn their place and realize whatever genius they had on the outside wasn't worth much here. However, now they fell into silence. There were no longer any jeers, no longer any talks of beauty leaderboards, there was only a quiet brewing. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit novelnext.com to experience faster update speed. This chapter is updated by NOVLBAN. It seems that they would have to put some more effort into showing these juniors exactly where their place was in the hierarchy. What was a military without strict rules? What was a military without strict hierarchy? The sooner these juniors learned exactly how well they placed, the better. Of course, while there were many with these thoughts, there were also a few faction leaders who licked at their lips, already communicating with their networks to see how many resources they could move around to pull these geniuses into their fold. However, in that time, when people were shocked awake by their thoughts, they were suddenly stunned to find that Lionel was actually getting faster rather than slowing down. They had been shocked by the appearance of Aina and then subsequently Amory. They hadn't even noticed that in the time it had taken them to clear the first floor, Lionel had already long since moved on and stepped onto the fourth. Each floor should have been getting more difficult. No one could wrap their heads around why Lionel was only getting faster. Was it because he hadn't been trying earlier? Was he not aware that there were records on the line? These leaderboards weren't just for show. Those that could enter the top 3 would gain equivalent resources for as long as they maintained it. These rewards were even more plentiful when it was the all-time leaderboard. For Lionel to be taking it easy wasn't cool, it was foolish. What these people didn't know, though, was that Lionel really was unaware of the leaderboard. But even so, he wasn't taking it easy. He's becoming more efficient, Cornelius thought to himself. This thought was the very same thought every individual in the crowd who had a calculative ability or mind concluded. And the more they observed, the more lost they seemed to become in Lionel's art. Lionel never used more effort than the last time. Yet his needles became faster, the arcs of his daggers became sharper, and when he finally brought out a javelin. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net follow current novels on Novel Bin. Lionel's chest expanded, his gaze lighting with a fiery light. His hips locked into place, his thighs bulging and his torso tightening to the point his body became a wall of steel. His left arm cocked back, his wrist stabilized, his forearm flexing and his shoulder coming to a grinding halt as he reached back as far as his flexibility would allow. He locked eyes on a towering red-scaled python slithering up 20 meters into the sky, not even counting its coiled and stabilizing base. And then the world seemed to split. Foo! Bang! The javelin shot out from Lionel's grip like an iron ball out of a cannon. The air imploded and violent concentric circles of wind quickly formed, only to be left behind in an instantaneous blink. Bang! The scales of the python split before the javelin even landed. And by the time it did, a hole with a 3-meter diameter was blasted through its skull. Lionel broke the 2-minute mark, and yet he was completely oblivious. He had already moved up from 58th to 1st on 2 all-time leaderboards, but his eyes seemed to still be calculating, spinning at speed most couldn't understand. He wanted more efficiency, greater efficiency, and it wasn't without reason. These beasts had only ever been at the 5th dimension, and Lionel simply didn't believe that things would continue like this. The Void Palace was far too sadistic to allow anyone to reach the galaxy rank while just displaying 5th-dimensional strength. If he couldn't become efficient, he would quickly find himself ruined. Just as advertised, the moment the horde of the 5th floor appeared, Lionel's gaze narrowed, his vision coming into very sharp focus. It was another group of reptilian serpents, but they all had back-like wings and spewed acid from their mouths. However, this wasn't too much to accept. What was difficult, though, was that they were all outrageously fast and each and every one had entered the 6th dimension. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1404. Published at 21st of November 2022 9:46 and 42 seconds AM. Chapter 1404. All out. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel exhaled a breath. He tested the range of his elevation height again, just to see if he was locked into his same rules, and quickly found out that the answer was yes. That much was still fine. The point of the shield he was riding on wasn't to escape, the only purpose it served was to allow Lionel to maneuver and throw at the same time. It was easier to do it like this than it would be with his wings because it could counterbalance his downward force with upward thrust. The air pressure shifted, the atmosphere is different, the anarchic force concentration has raised. Lionel's mind began to calculate once more, adjusting his effective range, his throwing speed, and the output of force that would minimize his stamina drain while maximizing lethality. It was all completed in the blink of an eye. Lionel zipped forward in the next, his left hand reaching for his body once against and pulling out 6 long needles, nestling 2 apiece to 3 gaps between his fingers. His gaze turned cold and the world seemed to be covered in numbers. His arm whipped forward, releasing all 6 needles at once. But through the air, it truly looked as though there were only 3. They flew so close together and so perfectly that they might as well have been flying as one. However, in a blink, one had surpassed the other, zooming forward with a burst of acceleration the other simply didn't have. Even with this change, it looked just the same. 3 streaks through the skies, each just as blinding and powerful as the other. They arced through the air as one, curving through the air until they hit their targeted 3 different flying serpents, each right beneath the jaw. The needles collided with their targets and then sprung away as though meeting steel walls. Lionel's bow force might as well have been a splash of water to them. However, just as quickly as this occurred. Beseech you. Beseech you. Beseech you. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. To experience faster update speed, visit Novelbin. For the best understanding experience. The second line of 3 needles landed in the exact same spot, skewering the flying serpents. However, Lionel only shook his head. With his sharp eyes, he could see that the needles had only penetrated a part of the way through, taking advantage of what had been a micro tear. But the flying serpents were only knocked back for a moment and hardly felt the attack, let alone dying from it. That was part of the reason, despite his skill in throwing, Lionel always gravitated back toward a bow. The effort to power output of a bow was simply on an entirely different level. He had gone all out with that throw just now but had barely pierced skin. To make matters worse, in order to maximize his control of these shields and these throwing objects, he had chosen the former to be at the 4th dimension and the latter to be at the 5th. Lionel obviously didn't have telekinetic abilities, he was using his Earth variant affinity to control these metals to do his bidding. If he could only throw weapons but not retrieve them, he would very quickly run out. And holding all of these weapons wasn't nearly as good as having a single spatial treasure that only held arrows like he had seen this damn tower provide. So, because his weapons were only at the 5th dimension, they had an even harder time piercing skin. Of course, the Void Tower didn't allow you to just choose weapons of whatever dimension you wanted. But, here, the 6th dimension was considered standard. Lionel had to purposely demote himself to maximize his chances. The Rapax had really done a good job of screwing him this time around. Lionel could only sigh. There's only one way. I guess I have to stop worrying about stamina and resource consumption. Lionel swerved out of the way of a projectile of acid, his gaze glowing. Runes began to appear within his irises one after another. First 1, then 2, then 4, then 8. The space around him trembled. Lionel's fingers flicked backward, causing the 3 needles that had been knocked off course to rush back to his hands. He snagged them out of the air and threw them back with even more force than before. This time, however, they left a trail of crimson in their wake, a burning inferno threatening to melt everything in its path, erupting. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net, SS Novel B, in XSS. The 3 needles landed exactly where they had originally, driving into the butt of their stuck counterparts. There was nothing the flying serpents could do to dodge this. Scree! Bang! An enormous hole was ripped through their throats and out the back of their skulls. Lionel exhaled a light breath, steam pushing out through his teeth and lips, red flickering within his irises. He had already pushed himself to the limit once today and managed to get back on his feet. But, since then he had fought a battle with Amory, then used several hours to draw an array back to the human domain. With the current state of his mind, sustaining 8 destruction runes was a tall order. And it only made it worse that once he used it, the object he had used it on would be finished and vanish for good. Lionel had a few hundred throwing knives and objects, but facing beast hordes, he didn't know if it would last even 3 more floors, and he still wasn't sure exactly how far he had yet to travel. But facing this opportunity, there was only one real path to take. He had to go all out. Lionel's chest heaved, the daggers he plucked away from his hip already glowing a fiendish shade of red before he even finished imbuing them with his mark. You annoying spitting snakes put me in this situation, come die then. Lionel unleashed a barrage of relentless assaults, razing everything to the ground. There was nothing elegant and beautiful about his efficiency any longer. He saw a target and he destroyed it from the inside out. Nothing more, nothing less. Chapter 1405. Published at 21st of November 2022 9:46 and 41 seconds AM. Chapter 1405. 9th floor. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel breathed heavily. His body was still fine, not having suffered any wounds just yet. But anyone who had been watching him battle previously would notice quite a striking difference. You could actually see the skin-tight black fabric that wrapped around him, making his arm sling and useless right arm all the more obvious. Lionel had been right. By the end of the 7th floor, he had run out of flying daggers and needles, making his life a living hell on the 8th. It had taken him almost 10 minutes to clear the whole of the 8th floor, and the 9th floor started off even worse. The beasts from the 5th floor to this point had all been in Tier 1 of the 6th dimension, however they had all been relatively weak and easier to handle. If Lionel had to describe it, it wasn't quite like what fighting 6th-dimensional experts from the Milky Way would feel like, but it was only barely a step above. The difficulty of these towers obviously wasn't in quality, at least not for this version. It was more so in quantity. Until the 9th floor, that is. Lionel was suddenly faced with a horde of blue-furred, 4-armed apes. Runes flickered about their bodies, giving Lionel a sort of stifling feeling, as though no matter how hard he attacked them, he would never be able to break through their defenses. Lionel didn't quite understand where these runes were coming from, if they were similar to his own destruction runes or something entirely different. But once he stepped into the God Path, he would understand what these runes represented and exactly why it was Conan had said stepping into the 6th dimension would help them all to close the gap between themselves and Lionel's innate node. These were indeed runes similar to Lionel's destruction runes, and they were, indeed, primed toward defense. And yes, that did mean that Lionel's task had suddenly become another living nightmare. Shit. It was suffice to say that Lionel's record-breaking streak had come to an end. They could all see it. But they could also see the reasons why this was. No one knew the details of this year's true selection, but it had caused a major commotion that resulted in even Void Senate members clashing heads. Just looking at Lionel and Amory, it was clear that the both of them had taken this the hardest. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit novelnext.com to experience faster update speed. The latest episodes are on the NOVL by N website. But by contrast, Aina only seemed to shine brighter. Lionel had done the bulk of the work when it came to battling in the Rapak's nest, much to her dissatisfaction, so this was clearly one reason. But the truth was that even if this wasn't the case, simply put, Aina's stamina was quite literally endless. And even if she somehow ran into a wall, she could just snatch stamina from others. When you could tap into your life force and the life force of others whenever you pleased, physical limitations wasn't something you would ever face, at least not when you were in your right mind. The berserk state that Aina's previously faulty berserk god lineage factor sent her into was almost always the reason she spiraled out of control and overextended herself. Now that she was healed, that was nothing more than a problem of the past. If she needed to battle for months or even years without rest, she could do so. Lionel was forced into a corner, unable to dodge as a fist half the size of his body crashed right into his chest. Luckily, he managed to activate his bronze runes first, mitigating much of the damage. But this was just yet another stamina drain that he now had to sustain. Blood flew from his lips, his ribs threatening to crack as he was sent barreling away. Maybe the worst part of the situation was that the only reason his ribs had managed to survive was because his right arm was slung across his body, forcing it to take the brunt of the hit. The pain was like a fire lighting in his flesh, and Lionel's mind threatened to go blank for a moment. If not for a timely use of dream sense, it might have really happened. He crashed against the ground, managing to use the momentum to spring up and flip to his feet, his heels still grinding into the ground as he slid backward. There was only one enormous ape left. He was certain that he had already shot well over the 10-minute mark, but he wasn't even aware of a leaderboard to begin with, so these matters were the furthest thing from his mind. I guess that's the only way. Lionel took deep breaths, wiping the blood from his mouth before his aura surged one more time. The images of an enormous red-gold star appeared above his head. He pointed 2 fingers toward the sky, wild spear force forming and concentrating before shooting upward. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. Visit novelbin.com for the best no-understanding experience. The blue ape had entered a mad charge, barreling toward Lionel on all fours as it lumbered over. In that moment, the concentrated spear force began to swirl about the 3-meter-tall star, quickly forming the tip of a drill that spun faster and faster and faster. Lionel breathed heavily, pushing his universal force to its limits as the ape entered a 10-meter range. His fingers descended from the sky, pointing right at the charging ape. Die. The star shot forward, the golden drill before it acting as a vanguard as it tore through space, appearing before the charging ape in the blink of an eye. The ape rose to its hind legs, its chest expanding and the runes upon it glowing with a fierce light. It roared out, smashing 2 fists toward the rotating drill. Bang, bang, bang. Sparks flew, a stalemate suddenly ensuing for just a moment, until Lionel's spear force finally won out. Laced by his king's might, it tore into the runes of the ape, shredding them to pieces and eventually its entire body. Lionel collapsed to a single knee, his chest heaving, but the environment around him had already begun to shift. The world of black vanished, replaced by a resplendent white. A young man stood in the distance beneath a small tree, his delicate hand reaching up to lightly touch a golden apple. He seemed too handsome for words, as though he shouldn't belong in this world at all. This kid really has terrible luck. How long has it been since one of the spirituals race has appeared in the Void Tower? Cornelius thought to himself. Important announcement below. Chapter 1406. Published at 21st of November 2022 9:46 and 39 seconds AM. Chapter 1406. Adworth. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel took deep breaths, observing the scene before him. He couldn't quite understand what was happening. Since nothing had been explained before, he had headed into this completely blind. He had no way of telling what he should be doing, if this was an enemy, if it was a break room, or if he should be worried or not. He had no way of communicating with Wise Star Order. Even his innate node which had been beneath his tongue couldn't be felt by him any longer, let alone any of his other treasures. If it wasn't for this, Lionel wouldn't have had nearly as many problems using his destruction runes. I guess since this is the 10th floor it was due for a bit of a change. They must treat this a lot like a video game with a boss every 10th floor. But why is this environment so different, and why hasn't this man attacked me yet? Despite his thoughts, Lionel took every second he had to regain his breath. He couldn't do much about the drained state of his mind, but he could at least try to let his healing factor kick in a bit to help with his physical fatigue. At the same time he circulated his force through his nodes, allowing them to do the work they were meant to and quickly flood his body with oxygen. Lionel looked around. No needles, no daggers, I used up the last of my javelins on those apes. It seems that all I've got now is myself. Lionel stood. He didn't understand what was going on, but what he did know was that if this was an enemy, their patience wouldn't be nothing more than a detriment to him. He didn't believe that in such a trial, an enemy would be so nonchalant without cause or reason. This individual was definitely benefiting from his inaction somehow, or at the very least, this was the highest likelihood of what was otherwise a toss-up. Lionel liked to live his life based on probability, so knowing such a thing he couldn't remain inactive. The moment he stood to his feet, though, the young man seemed to finally notice Lionel's presence. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed. S is by N. Oval by N. The moment their eyes met, Lionel took an explosive step backward, his pupils constricting and his heart nearly leaping out of his chest. Any fatigue he had seemed to be forgotten, allowing adrenaline to rush forward in its place. This is bad. Lionel didn't like his reaction just now at all. Adrenaline sounded nice, but the crash that came on the other side was very much real. It would have been better if he output what remaining stamina he had left in a steady stream rather than releasing it all in a sudden outburst. However, Lionel couldn't help it. Right then, his hairs had stood on end and his mind rang with blaring warning signs. He had quite literally felt as though his very soul was about to be pulled out of his body. The feeling was similar to when Y-Star Order had tricked him into reading the protected technique of the spirituals, except 100 times more potent. It was almost like a harpoon had latched onto him. Lionel had not a single clue just the kind of commotion his actions just now had caused. Let alone others. Cornelius finally stood stunned, unable to speak a single word. One of the most cursed objects of the Void Palace was the Void Tower. This was because so much of one's progress during a single run could be decided by good or bad luck, and definitely more especially the latter. There were a few things though that went beyond just bad luck. These chance events of the Void Tower were known by the students as drawing dead. It didn't matter what happened, how prepared you were, how good your run up until that point had been. So long as one of these events occurred, your run would be over. One of these so-called drawing dead events was the appearance of a spiritual as a boss. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Bin. Com to experience faster update speed. The only way to combat a spiritual in real life was to have a soul-protecting treasure on hand. The human domain never did battle with the spirituals without outfitting an entire army with them, and missions were never completed in spiritual territory on the void battlefield without them either. However, as one might have already guessed, it was impossible to bring treasures into the Void Tower, and the only weapons available in the armory you got to choose from were very simple weapons without any special effects whatsoever. So, what would you do in the face of a spiritual without a soul protection treasure? Well, what else could you do but wait to die? There was nothing else you could do. Some of the spear factions had already begun to feel sorry for Lionel. After all, even though he didn't know it, they knew well that so long as he cleared this 10th floor on his first run, he would become among the few in Void Palace history to ever be directly admitted as a galaxy-ranked disciple. However, running into a spiritual after having the bad luck of being given beast hordes to begin with, it could only be said that luck was truly not on Lionel's side. According to the usual pattern, so long as you remained unmoving, the spiritual would be too enamored by its precious tree to even bother with you. But, the moment you did, it would look at you and your mind would go blank. Game over. And yet, somehow, Lionel had risen up, moved, made eye contact, and still managed to explosively retreat, all without losing? How was that possible? Within the crowd, a particular young man stood in silence. His hair was bronzed, his eyes deep and somber. His stature was large and his shoulders were broad. His presence was sharp as a spear and as sturdy as a mountain. Even now, there was no shortage of looks of admiration and respect being aimed in his way. He was none other than the first Nova, Adworth Morales. He smiled to himself seeing this scene. Then he turned on his heels and walked into the distance. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1407. Published at 21st of November 2022 9:46 and 38 seconds AM. Chapter 1407. Drawing Dead? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. At that moment, Aina exited the tower, followed a few moments later by Amory. Aina had climbed to the 12th floor before running into some bad luck of her own. Well, she had technically run into said bad luck on the 11th floor where she was faced with a skeleton graveyard. Without any blood force to take advantage of, strength at tier 2 of the 6th dimension, stacked with God path comprehension, was beyond what she could contend with. In order to cross the 11th floor, she essentially drained herself of all her life force, knowing that it was a simulation. But, facing even more undead on the 12th floor, there was really nothing that she could do to contend, leading to her loss. As for Amory, he climbed to the 10th, clearing it before he directly stopped. It was clear he knew things that Lionel and Aina didn't, so he hadn't even tried to go beyond. Stepping out, he rose his head to the leaderboards, giving them a once-over. When he saw that Lionel was still inside and facing a spiritual at that, his gaze narrowed, an expression that only became darker when he realized that Lionel actually hadn't died. Aina's attention had been on Lionel from the very beginning. When she realized the race Lionel was up against, her brows too shot up. Beauty. How about you join my Morning Dew faction? We'll give you a 100 void point daily spending quota and this big brother here will be your personal bodyguard. Fuck off, 100 void points? Are you trying to entice a beauty? Or call up a common street whore? Piss off, beauty. My Twin Rope faction will give you a 10,000 void point monthly spending limit. This chapter upload first at NovelBin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit novelnext.com to experience faster update speed. Is by NovelBin. The shouts instantly drowned out all the quiet, flooding the area with the bustling sounds of bids as though Aina was merchandise to be bought. No one bothered to try to entice Amory, knowing full well exactly who had joined, there was simply no point. However, Aina was a different matter entirely and her performance had been simply outstanding. Shut up all of you. An overwhelming pressure crushed the growing noise, the delicate voice that called out still somehow seeming like a clap of thunder. Most almost immediately shut their mouths, moving out of the way as a beauty sauntered over. They all recognized this woman quite well. There was no man of the Void Palace that wouldn't. Number 3 on the Queen Beauty rankings, Vega Aquarius. However, this identity of hers was most definitely the weakest, because she also happened to be the faction leader of the Limpid Touch faction. Not just any faction but a gold-grade faction. The Limpid Touch faction was most definitely a frontrunner to soon become a legacy faction as it was well known that Vega would soon meet the requirements to become the part of a party. As such, the current Limpid Touch faction was in a sort of contentious time as Vega waited to choose her successor and the soon-to-be second leader of the Limpid Touch faction. The trouble was that while the faction was filled with talents, none were so greatly superior over the other that there would be no pushback toward her choice. Knowing all of this, Vega's purpose here was all too obvious. Although Aina had only just appeared, the talent she displayed was unlike anything they had seen in a very long time. That along with the fact she was a beauty that lost out to Vega in no way, made Aina quite literally the perfect candidate. Vega would have to slow her plans down a bit and push some things back so that she could groom Aina, but it would most definitely be worth it. It was like this present had fallen right into her lap. The prestige of a legacy faction was something she had wanted for a very long time. Only by making the Limpid Touch faction a legacy faction could it gain the foundation and strength to become a party. Once that happened, she could return as its leader, making her a party head with some real weight and authority. This chapter upload first at NovelBin. Net. New novel chapters are published on NovelBin. Such a thing though couldn't be accomplished with just a single astounding talent. There were many talents in her faction, but the number on Vegas level was 0. If Aina was added, that number would tick up to 1. One pillar was shaky, but 2 pillars were a different matter entirely. Little sis, my name is Vega. If you join my Limpid Touch faction, I'm willing to give you 1,000,000 void point and 10 void merit allowance a month. We'll also give you a free pass to any of our stores and libraries. Also, Vegas offers had already caused the crowd to suck in a cold breath. Many who had made offers previously could only blush in embarrassment, falling into hushed silence and scurrying into the crowd to escape from the jeers. However, Vega still came to a pause, realizing that Aina wasn't actually paying attention to her at all. Vega's cherry lips closed, her expression not faltering at all. She was truly worthy of her title of Queen Beauty. Her blue dress, embroidered by gorgeous green and gold patterns, clung to her every curve. Her hair was a radiant and almost fairy tale-like blue, her eyes shimmering a deep and vast emerald. Even being ignored, her expression was calm and her small hands clasped to her front, following Aina's gaze to the screen above. Ah. Aina looked back, seemingly feeling that someone was talking to her. I'm sorry, a moment please. Then she turned back to the screen, focusing her entire attention on it. Vega had only rushed here after receiving a report from her subordinates and had only paid attention to Aina's screen from the very beginning. Her faction only had women in it to begin with, and she also didn't have time to spend on juniors. If not for the insistence of some of her faction, she wouldn't have come at all, and she was glad she had. But now finally paying attention to Lionel's screen, her gaze couldn't help but narrow. Drawing Dead? The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1408. Published at 21st of November 2022 9:46 and 36 seconds AM. Chapter 1408. Lake Prison. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel stood easily 50 meters away from the spiritual, his brows locked into a deep frown. Is this man a spiritual then? Or is he a human with an ability to target souls? I don't think I've ever heard of the latter, but I've never seen Aina's ability index in a compendium either. It's possible that this is a uniquely evolved ability. I have seen those before and they can't be documented. Though Lionel thought this, he was more inclined to believe that this man before him was a spiritual. He looked simply too perfect. It reminded Lionel a lot of Wise Star Order's appearance. Souls tended to be extremely pure and more beautiful than the bodies they came from, according to Wise Star Order anyway. This was because souls could be idealized thanks to their more intangible forms. In addition, a body had to undergo certain abuses a soul never would. For example, nutrition, injury, environment, all of these things could negatively affect the perfection of a body. The soul, though, was protected by its shell of flesh and thus avoided this. Of course, if this man was a spiritual, what Lionel was seeing right now wasn't a soul, but rather the body it had created for itself, a body which, likewise, wasn't subject to the same harsh realities of a human's body. Like Wise Star Order had said, spirituals formed their own bodies after their births. Being able to mold themselves in their own image like this would obviously give birth to the same sort of overdone perfection. Well, I guess my Aina is an exception. If others knew that Lionel had wasted a thought for such a clarification, who knew how they would react? Now that Lionel had calmed, though, he noticed several things. Well, several things outside the fact he was even more tired now than before. The first was that this spiritual wasn't in the 6th dimension at all, they were in the 5th. Lionel had a feeling that if his soul was still in the 5th as well, that attack just now would have most definitely killed him. The gap in skill was almost too much even for the dimensional gap to overcome. The second was that this man seemed to now be frowning a bit, almost as though he was surprised that Lionel was still standing. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed. S is by N. Oval by N. The third was the tree and especially the golden apple. Lionel hadn't really thought about it before, but why was it here? Was there something important about it? It was then that he felt a subtle sort of connection between the man and it. But almost as soon as he did, it was as though his internal sight had rammed into a steel wall, being rebuffed and knocked flying. Lionel almost subconsciously fell backward, only to realize it was only his mind that had been sent soaring. Lionel retrieved his internal sight, reining it in and sending it forward again, only for the result to be just the same. And then he tried again, then again. Lionel's gaze narrowed, stepping forward, slowly. He closed the distance between himself and the young man. The rebuffing became more and more powerful, but every time it happened, Lionel seemed to get better at handling it. Do it again. Lionel thought silently to himself. What he spoke about wasn't the internal sight sparring at all. He meant something entirely different. Lionel eventually stepped to the very spot he had been in before when he explosively retreated, and that was when he felt it. No, this time, with his internal sight deployed, he could almost see it. It speared through the air, appearing before his forehead in the blink of an eye. It was so fast that it was almost impossible to dodge. Almost. Lionel's head tilted to the side, but he was still a step too late. The harpoon threaded into the side of his forehead, snagging at a piece of his soul and trying to rip it out. For just a moment, Lionel didn't fight back against the sensation, feeling it pulling at him. The feeling was much less life-threatening than it had been before, but he could feel that if he allowed it to happen, his mind would be irreparably harmed. This wasn't the kind of injury you could heal. Lionel was certain wouldn't have even the slightest effect. However, this was just a simulation. Lionel felt that if there was any place he could toe the line like this, it was in this place. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net visit novelbin.com for the best no understanding experience. Just when Lionel felt like his soul was truly about to be ripped out, his will flourished, his dream force pulling back and his stars began to rotate faster. The weak hold the harpoon had had on him weakened even further, snapping and releasing Lionel. However, at that moment, Lionel's partially awakened soul seemed to have perked up more. Again. Lionel said, taking another step forward. The spiritual didn't need Lionel's input. He had already attacked again the moment Lionel moved. Lionel's head shifted again, but this time he purposely let himself get nicked. Lionel repeated the process again and again. Slowly, from somewhere deep within the recesses of Lionel's body, his soul was slowly being dragged out from its slumber. With each attempt, Lionel's dream force seemed to become thicker, his affinity deepening and his ability index trembling, creeping forward at a slow but steady pace. In an odd, unknown world, a version of Lionel stood. Its arms dangled forward limply, its legs pinned down to the ground and its head drooping, its expression impossible to spot. All around it, a dense lake of crimson lay, its hands and feet bound within. Black chains wrapped around it entirely, shackling its neck, its torso and its hips. However, the greatest anchor seemed to be the lake of red itself. What very much seemed to be a pool of blood. Every time the harpoon nicked Lionel, it would stir, its head raising slightly. By the time Lionel had closed the distance to the spiritual to just 10 meters, its head had risen just high enough to see a pair of eyes just barely cracking open. A chain snapped, the blood lake suddenly beginning to boil. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1409. Published at 23rd of November 2022 7:34 and 54 seconds AM. Chapter 1409. Flood. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Sorry to everyone who saw the earlier 2-day hiatus message. I guess I lied. Lionel's body convulsed, the white of his eyes being taken over by a deep red. Despite this, he felt oddly in control of his body, so much so that it was almost as though adrenaline had been injected right into his heart. Even still, he couldn't feel the needle. Something snapped and his dream force rolled out in waves, the strength of his internal sight increasing tenfold and his ability index taking another enormous leap forward. The world slowed and the complex runes of his Scarlet Star Force almost felt simple. His internal sight only swept over it just a single time, but his number of comprehended runes increased from 8 to 9 in the blink of an eye. At that moment, the red-gold runes snapped together as though pulled by a rubber band, forming a larger rune that danced within Lionel's irises as though it had a mind of its own. Lionel didn't even need to check. In that moment he was absolutely certain that he had perfectly grasped third-dimensional Scarlet Star Force. So long as he wanted to do so, using his mage core, he could rip it out of the atmosphere just like his stars had done. Of course, this didn't mean that these runes were third-dimensional. Even for Scarlet Star Force, using the third dimension to harm the sixth dimension was impossible. If this had been the case, then the use of his runes against the Raypax would have only been a lesson in futility. Rather, it was more accurate to say that grasping these destruction runes gave Lionel all the knowledge he needed to understand the foundation of his Scarlet Star Force and thus use its third-dimensional form without harming himself or using an innate node as a medium. However, this wasn't what Lionel was focused on at all. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit novelnext.com to experience faster update speed. SS Novel B. In. XSS. His mind seemed to be boiling, spilling over with strength that seemed to come out of nowhere. It was almost too much, as though he was suddenly being overwhelmed with strength that he had no method of controlling. It spilled over, rushing out of his body and into the surroundings. The sudden change made Lionel's expression change. He had never been able to force his dream force out of his body before, it had never allowed him to do so. Everything he did with dream force was constrained within his body. Even when he drew mage arts using dream force, the process was internal, and yet had an effect on the outside world, similar to how internal sight functioned. There was a reason internal sight had its name. Although it could be used to observe the outside world, its roots were internal, and its external influence was a sort of force field of sorts and not truly tangible, at least not in the most obvious of ways. What the hell? Lionel was so focused on himself that he didn't even notice the spiritual sent forward another harpoon. But, before it could even get close, it became stuck in a swamp of dream force, before being crushed and twisted as though it had suddenly run into a heavy gravitational environment. It didn't have the structural integrity to survive. The spiritual's brows furrowed, its gaze flickering with a hint of fear and apprehension. It wanted to retreat, feeling that Lionel was a danger, but every time it thought of doing so, it looked toward its tree and then back at Lionel before turning back to the tree. The truth was that spirituals paid a price for their oneness with nature. Well, from a human perspective, it was a price. To a spiritual, at least the one in question, it was a beautiful thing. To wider spiritual society, though, it was a curse and a mental illness. Just as easily as a spiritual could fall in love with another member of their species, it was just as likely for them to fall in love with a beast or, in this case, a tree. Things wouldn't be so bad if the target of their affection could move, but in this case it couldn't. Well, the spiritual might refuse to move from a singular location all their lives. In practice, this was actually quite rare. Most spirituals would never end up feeling this sort of connection, and still some others, even upon feeling it, would choose to sever it entirely to maintain their freedom. However, the trouble was that in taking the latter approach, said spiritual would lose much of their oneness with nature and thus their affinity upon making such a choice. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. The source of this content is novel.bin.com. Likely in order to make this boss fight more fair, the spawned spiritual was anchored to a tree it was in love with. It was almost like an Easter egg, an opportunity for easy victory. So long as the tree was destroyed, the spiritual would fall into despair and likely kill themselves, thus resulting in victory. Unfortunately, things almost never worked out in this way. A soul attack was far faster than any physical attack. The only reason Lionel could even begin to dodge was because he sensed it coming before it was levied. It was impossible to destroy the tree before the spiritual killed you. But, in this case, Lionel's dream force continued to roll out of him, refusing to listen to any of his commands. The spiritual stood before his tree to protect it, unwilling for any harm to come to it. But Lionel's dream force continued, coming out in wave after wave. When the dream force made contact with the spiritual, nothing seemed to happen at all. But the spiritual's eyes still widened. Lionel's dream force was like a thick oil, latching onto his skin and blocking all of his pores. Even when the spiritual tried to project his soul out again to attack Lionel and stop this madness, he found that his soul rebounded against its skin, being locked into his body. Lionel continued to stand in silence, his mind still clear as he focused on trying to take control of himself again. He couldn't decide whether what was happening was a good or bad thing. What was happening to him exactly? Chapter 1410. Published at 23rd of November 2022 7:34 and 52 seconds AM. Chapter 1410. So what? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. It was odd. Dream force was meant to be one of the most dangerous forces in all of existence. As the arbiter of consciousness, having it in too large a supply was always a bad thing, as those who didn't have high affinity for it would find the line between fiction and reality blurred, a lot like what a schizophrenic would experience. Dream force carried with it the power of perception, and fundamentally, perception was often reality. If someone had a dream about being invincible, they would wake up and this feeling would be gone. In addition, they would then be able to pick out all the oddities in the dream that should have made it obvious to them that it was one. However, if the dream force was cranked up, suddenly the line wouldn't be so obvious. The dream would become too real, too tangible. Then, you'd suddenly have a person jumping out of a building as a mere mortal in the real world because they got it in their heads that they were invincible. The effects went beyond dreams as well. Just things as simple as thoughts, inclinations, biases, etc., could easily become too real to ignore. Suddenly, an opinion would become objective fact, a daydream would be reality, a hope would become certainty. Believe it or not, these would be the most benign effects of excessive dream force. Beyond this, one might sink into a forever coma, believing their dreams to be the new reality. And, in the worst of cases, one's mind could collapse, forgetting how to function correctly and thus leading to the most direct cause of death. Playing with consciousness was dangerous. Almost like playing with layers of irony, eventually if you went deep enough, you would lose the ability to tell where the joke started and where it ended. However, somehow, despite all these dangers, the spiritual was fine. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. To experience faster update speed, visit novelbin.com. For the best experience, it was like Lionel's dream force was in a benign state. Despite being able to come out of his body now, he still wasn't able to use it to attack people or harm them. Lionel had known that his ability limited him in this way for a long time. In fact, even Lionel, who had reached Tier 5 and could project his dream force outward, couldn't use it to harm others directly either. He could only mold his dream force to shape reality and use said changes to attack his enemies. However, Lionel couldn't do that. Not to mention the fact he was fairly certain he hadn't been born a savant due to the existence of his lineage factors and his innate node. Right this moment, he still couldn't even begin to control this dream force. How was he supposed to manipulate reality if he couldn't even stop it from flowing outward? I need to change my approach, do something different. Lionel began to make a scan of his body, going through every vital sign and checking for any stages. But before he could even get halfway through the analysis, he froze. Whenever Lionel wanted to do in-depth analysis, he would always enter his dream world. Everything flowed faster there and he was in control of every single variable. His models were vivid, his mind seemed to work at twice the pace and it was easy to visualize everything. But never had his thoughts appeared in the real world like this. Lionel stood, stunned, a perfect replica of himself standing right in front of him. It was illusory and its skin was quite blue, but Lionel could see it, not with his mind's eye but with his real eyes. His dream clone, it was standing right in front of him. What the hell? Lionel lost focus, causing the dream clone to waver and almost completely collapse. No. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net visit Novelbin.com for the best no understanding experience. Lionel settled his mind, and the dream clone stabilized again. It felt as though he was looking right at a hologram, as real and tangible as such a thing could get. He stretched out a hand, but his hand passed right through it, just like it would in his dream world. Lionel was baffled. His expression kept changing, trying to understand what this sort of change meant. Had his ability index evolved? Could he make illusions now? Warp reality? No, that didn't seem to be the case. Even when he tried to make himself more tangible than just a blue hologram, it didn't go very far. Even a toddler wouldn't be fooled by this image. In addition, if he couldn't even make an illusion, warping reality was an even further away pipe dream. This was very clearly something else entirely. If he had to describe it, it was like his dream world had suddenly manifested into reality. He could do everything he had been able to do in there or here now. But so what? Lionel couldn't think of what use such an ability could have. If he really applied it, he could probably become one of the greatest teachers or professors to ever exist, and he would be pretty good at relaying his thoughts precisely and with ease. But all of this felt a bit hollow. Maybe there was something more? Something greater on the other side? If only he could just retract his dream force. So long as he could do that, he could try to get the spiritual to work with him again, pulling out more of his soul. Lionel was certain that the result of this change was related to the changes to his soul, so he just had to try to replicate it to the best of his abilities. What Lionel didn't know, though, was that he had been frozen in place ever since those chains snapped. Everything that he had imagined himself and his environment doing, from the movement of the spiritual, to the flood of his dream force, to the appearance of his dream clone, and even down to the movement of his hand through its hologram, had never happened at all. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1411. Published at 6th of December 2022, 8:05 and 46 seconds AM. Chapter 1411. Perfectly. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Despite the fact he had concluded that the ability was useless, Lionel was still fascinated by the feeling. There was something especially immersive about having all of his ideas and thoughts floating around him. It made it all more real, more tangible. Although Lionel had always been able to sink into his dream world whenever he wanted, the disconnect between it and reality was such that he was always keenly aware of his real Bodhi's place in the world. Because of that, he could never fully enjoy himself. As such, he had always kept his dream world to the bare minimum. White walls, pale and transparent dream clones, even his dreamscape was nothing more than a skeleton of ideas, like jotted down notes only he could understand. When things were like this, though, Lionel felt more licensed to have fun. The world became overlapped with the vastness of space. His dreamscape became like constellations in the skies, its ideas connecting to form fantastical images and gorgeous picturesque scenes of legends gone by. His thoughts became organized into planets and their ecosystems, the trees carrying his thoughts, the waters carrying his streams of consciousness, the clouds becoming as fleeting and numerous as his daydreams. Lionel smiled. He didn't know why he hadn't done this before. Like this, everything seemed so much more beautiful. It connected in a way that surpassed what it had been capable of before, making his cold calculation feel a lot less like work and more like the masterful strokes of an artisan. Lionel became so lost in it all that his concept of time warped. It was only when he finally snapped out of it that his expression changed. How long had it been since he paid attention to what the spiritual had been doing? Just because the spiritual had powerful soul attacks, that didn't mean it was all they were capable of. They could just as easily attack with their bodies, or even make use of another one of their powerful abilities, elemental manipulation. Lionel's eyes snapped open, trying to find the spiritual. Wait, weren't his eyes already open? Hadn't he been observing his dream world being projected onto the real world? Isn't that why he was so confident in losing focus a bit to begin with? After all, if his soul was useless, the spiritual couldn't do much that Lionel wouldn't be able to react to. After all, the both of them were in the fifth dimension. If the former had to attack physically, Lionel was sure that he could at least do something about it. But if his eyes had always been open, why did he suddenly open them? Wait, if he had opened his eyes, then why was he still seeing the same thing? Lionel's gaze turned cold. He should have known this would happen. His dream force couldn't affect others, but it could definitely affect him. That was the main purpose of his ability index to begin with, and precisely why Tier 4 was called Control. The fact that he couldn't control the outflow of his dream force should have already told him that it had surpassed the barriers that his affinity could control. However, he had actually been slow in realizing such a simple fact. The situation wasn't entirely bad though. When others were lost in dream force, the most dangerous part was that they would become unaware. The fact that he knew that something was wrong already proved that he was beyond most people. The trouble was, even knowing he was trapped, he still couldn't separate dreams from reality. He couldn't even tell whether his eyes were open or not. There's something else here, something that he needed to deal with before he could find his way out. The situation outside seemed to only be getting odder. Lionel hadn't moved in several minutes, but the trouble was, neither did the spiritual. And it was then that it happened. This sent waves through the crowd, but the picture above was still frozen in place. Could it be that there had been a glitch in the Void Tower system and Lionel was actually just fine? Aina sighed a breath of relief. She had been worried that the run-in with the spiritual had affected Lionel's real body. Her worries weren't unfounded. The reason why the spiritual was in the fifth dimension despite the fact that Lionel had already stepped into sixth-dimensional floors was because the elders of the Void Palace were worried that the shock would be too much otherwise. So long as it was just a simple image glitch, she could accept this. Now, she just had to wait patiently for Lionel to come out. However, what happened next was somehow even more astonishing than a first clear event. Heavy gravity, first attempt, all-time novel be in. Hadn't Lionel just been tired? He had already been on his last legs, on the verge of collapsing. How did he clear the 11th floor? And setting a record that beat the previous by more than a minute. The crowd didn't know what to say. Cornelius didn't know what to say. It felt like they were the ones stuck in a dream, unable to extricate themselves. 450. 450. 450 was where the seventh dimension began. The doors of the tower opened on the dawn of the third day. A young man stumbled forward, but he lacked the strength to do much of anything. He tripped, his body falling forward. However, before he could hit the ground, a rush of fragrant wind assaulted him and swept him into a soft embrace. The young man didn't say a word, collapsing, his light snores ringing out just moments later. Aina held onto Lionel, her brows furrowed. Tears of blood ran down his face and caked his scalp, giving his hair a dark redder hue than it usually did. His fingers dripped with blood. Slung over her shoulders, she could still hear the pitter-patter as they hit the hard ground. His chest was practically a gaping cavity, his ribs torn open and his beating heart thrumming for the world to hear as pulsing golden runes laced around it. None of this made any sense. The Void Tower was a simulation and nothing more. Your real body never entered. How could it leave Lionel's body in such a state? What had happened to him? However, maybe the most shocking part was that his right arm was out of its sling. Somehow perfectly healed. Chapter 1412? Published at 6th of December 2022 8:05 and 45 seconds AM. Chapter 1412, L. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Aina brought out her axe, allowing it to hover in the air so that she could lay Lionel across its large blades. Although she could carry Lionel herself, because he was so much larger than her, she was worried about injuring him further than he already was by forcing him into an awkward position. As things stood, this was the best option. Aina turned back, somewhat frantically, feeling that Lionel's breath was far too weak and it seemed to only be getting weaker. She didn't understand how things had ended up like this, but it simply didn't matter until Lionel was at least stabilized first. Do you know where I can get him help? Vega had ended up staying here the entire time. But, the more she saw how attached to Lionel Aina already was, the more she felt that her dreams of claiming Aina for herself were slipping away further. At least not by any ethical means. Treatment isn't free. Vega replied. She wasn't wrong. Nothing in the Void Palace was free. There was a reason why the envoys sent to oversee the selection on planet Luxnix had been so eager. That time they spent, despite it technically being for work, was basically a vacation for them. The Void Palace was practically hell on earth for its students. There was nothing that didn't cost, and no small number of promising young talents had fallen because they couldn't afford medical treatment. Of course, the most talented of these promising youths usually had other backers to rely on. But for Aina and Lionel, who had only just arrived despite their talent, this spelled trouble. If an organization wanted to take advantage of their current weakness at this moment, it would almost be too easy. Luckily, there was a silver lining, and that would be competition. With their talent, it was likely that many would want them. Although no one understood what had happened to Lionel, they had at least watched his performance on the first 9 floors, and that much was enough. The trouble was, how many dared to compete with a gold-grade faction? And not just any gold-grade faction at that, but one on the verge of becoming a legacy faction? Aina's brows furrowed, clearly understanding this. Aren't there rewards for breaking records? She asked through gritted teeth. Vega's gaze shifted upward, looking at the long line of leaderboards that surrounded the tower. By now, Lionel's name appeared much too many times for comfort. The crowd had considerably thinned in recent days, but the intrigue around what was happening hadn't lessened in the slightest. Whether or not these records will hold up is one matter. However, even if the Senate decides to keep things as is, leaderboard rewards are calculated by the month, and we happen to be right in the middle of one, with the next turn being a little more than 2 weeks away. Vega looked back. Why would they do that? You might be ignorant to what the 74th floor means, but others are not. I myself have only managed to climb to the 48th floor. Of course, that's also because I have not entered the tower in years, as I've been focused on other things, but I can still guarantee that the me of back then shouldn't need to lift a finger to defeat someone within the 5th dimension. As for those who have climbed to the 74th floor, they're all in the Senate 7th dimensional powerhouses who dictate how things run here. Do you think they'll believe that someone of the 5th dimension was able to accomplish this? And on top of that, he's heavily injured, something that shouldn't be possible in the tower. It's obvious that something has gone wrong. If you're lucky, he'll be allowed a redo. However, considering what his father just did to the majority leader, I wouldn't bank on it. Aina's brows furrowed. His father? Obviously, she had no idea what had happened. But this matter had been the talk of the Void Palace until Lionel's matter seemed to have taken over. Unfortunately, it was exactly because of this that there was even less of a chance Lionel could get away with it. The Void Senate was definitely in the know, and the Unfettered Blade Party held all the power right now. It was already a dark enough time for spearmen in the Void Palace. As for Lionel, well, it didn't take a genius to understand that it might very well be worse. Vega didn't explain, instead choosing to talk about something else entirely. I won't take advantage of you, but I also won't help you for free. I have no obligation to. It's simple really, all you have to do is join my faction. The benefits I listed before will be the same, and I can also guarantee that once I enter the Void Senate, you will take my place and control the faction. N0VL next. Koimena's brows furrowed deeper. She didn't want to leave Lionel's side. She hadn't gotten to spend nearly enough time with him, and they had already been apart for over a year. She had been a part of the Void Palace long enough to know even if they were in the same organization, they might be worlds apart. The rules were strict and the room to maneuver was minimal. If she joined a faction, especially an ambitious one like this one, they would probably run her ragged for the sake of the group. That didn't even mention the trouble that would come with joining such a hot pot. There would definitely be waves of internal struggle. But she had already left Lionel alone for too long. His injuries were far too severe, and if he could have healed them, he would have already done so. This wouldn't work at all. She had to. Aina bit her lip, ready to accept. But before she could, a voice came over. What's this? Trying to exploit my sister-in-law in her most vulnerable state? You're quite shameless, Third Queen Beauty. A chuckle came from the distance as a bronze-haired young man appeared. He was quite sloppily dressed, but the brightness of his eyes was undeniable. It gave him a sort of charisma most lacked. He was the 4th Nova CO. Chapter 1413. Published at 6th of December 2022 8:05 and 44 seconds AM. Chapter 1413. Interest. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. CO was the very same Nova Oren and Zavnik had spoken about during their earlier conversations. He had gotten into the stalwart polearm party a step later than First Nova, leaving him fighting for its scraps. But, despite his supposedly desperate situation, one definitely couldn't tell by his demeanor that anything was wrong. His robes were in disorder, his hair was messy, but he still looked well-rested and sharp. If anything, he was just too lazy to groom himself any better than he already had. Vega's eyes narrowed, looking back toward Sio with a sharp look. Hey, don't look at me like that, I scare easily. Are you interfering with my business? Have you forgotten the lesson I taught you last time? Vega's gaze turned dangerous, her hair rippling about. She had already wasted several days here and she was close to getting what she wanted. But now it felt like someone was snatching food she was just about to bite down on away. Sio sighed and shook his head. These are simply the lumps a romantic like me must take in pursuing love. I dared to bare my heart and I suffered for it. As a man, I can only respect your decision and move on, but why must you dig up my scars like so? Vega lost her patience, suddenly striking out with a palm. Sio didn't have a chance at all to dodge, facing the full brunt of it crashing into his chest. Clang. Oof. Sio stumbled several steps backward, coughing. Bronze runes flickered across his body. It was clear that while he had been slow to react in action, his runes still activated on instinct. Sio beat a fist against his chest, wheezing a bit. Good hit. Definitely solid. 8 out of 10. He raised up a thumb, giving Vega a sign for a job well done. It wasn't very surprising that Vega was actually much stronger than Sio. The trouble was that Sio was a bit shameless. Sio took Velasco as his idol, and his romantic life reflected that. He had already snagged several women from Vega's faction, and yet still somehow had the audacity to chase after Vega herself. It could be said that his face was quite thick. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. To experience faster update speed. Normally, Vega wouldn't care about this. Her faction might have been female only, but she didn't monitor their relationships so long as it didn't interfere with their duties. The trouble was, this time it did. In fact, it could be said that about 20% of the strain of her faction currently was caused by this man here. Sio had managed to woo 2 of her 7 Valkyries. And they also happened to be 2 of the 3 or 4 most likely to succeed her. When they found out that they had both been with the same man, they became like oil and water. If they were both somehow on fire. Vega had managed to suppress much of these issues, and Aina felt like the perfect remedy to deal with this matter once and for all, but then this bastard actually dared to appear before her again. Sio coughed again, finally straightening up. Still, even if you're mad third queen beauty, I still have my duties as a big brother to fulfill. Vega's expression twisted with disgust. Knowing Sio, it would be a miracle if Lionel was left with his underpants after all of this was through. Still, she turned on her heels and began to walk away without so much as a goodbye to anyone present. She had wasted enough time here, and the one rule that everyone had to follow in the Void Palace was no killing. Even if she beat Sio to a pulp, it wouldn't help her mood out. In fact, he would only take greater pleasure in ruining her plans. Sio grinned wildly, his eyes practically glued to Vega's swaying bottom as she glided into the distance. Damn, that woman's really like water, even her palm felt good. I really need to have me a taste. Aina's brows furrowed listening to Sio's vulgarity. She suddenly wasn't very certain if this was a good turn of events or not. Sio turned back, his eyes lighting up when he saw Aina's face. He had already known that this sister-in-law of his was beautiful, but to think she really lost out to the likes of Vega, in no way. Tiske, littlest Nova sure was lucky to have snagged something like this before stepping foot into the Void Palace. Where was the justice? This gaze, though, only made Aina's frown deepen. If not for the fact Sio had already become her last hope, she would have long since turned and left. Sio chuckled. No need to act like this. I'm greedy and lustful, but I never touched the women of my brothers. However, I will take their money. I'll pay for littlest Nova's treatment. But the interest? Well, let's just say that the interest won't be small. Sio grinned, his smile both devilishly handsome and demonic. Many dispersed and left the traffic around the Void Tower about normal for what it usually would be. However, the mystery around what exactly had happened felt heavier and deeper than many knew or were even willing to think about. Most assumed that the Void Senate would soon find out what happened and report these matters. But the oddity was that, this chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. The Void Tower was still open, functioning as though nothing at all had happened. Still, despite this, what was maybe even more shocking was that the Void Elders themselves were also baffled by exactly what had occurred as well. They stood in the air, unbeknownst to anyone, cloaked in black. You all sense it, right? Yes. This dream force. It leaked out from the inside. Nov LB in. "COM, you mean? For several days we didn't dare to approach this place, we could only let things play out as they would. But it seems that this dream force didn't have any malicious intent." "Maybe. But it also distorted reality to the point none of us know what happened inside." The cloaked figures fell into silence, their gazes turning toward Cornelius, who was still frozen in the air, unmoving. Cornelius might have an inkling of what happened as he was in range. Yes, but he's currently stuck in a dream loop. It will take him several months to pull himself out. Time might also not be the only price he pays. This isn't a normal application of dream force, it feels almost like a soul attack, like those under its influence were pulled in rather than the world around them distorting like usual. Another silence fell. What did Velasco do to this child? Someone finally asked. "I don't know if even the likes of Velasco can do this. But what I do know is that this child is even more trouble than his father. So, those of you who've been colluding to stab the human race in its back, I hope you glide on the tips of your toes a bit lighter. Novel be in." COM of Velasco's line seems intent on revenge. No one spoke a word as they gazed back and forth between one another. They had known that there were traitors among them for a very long time, but it was impossible to weed out exactly who it was. In recent decades, after Velasco had come into his own strength, the movements had only become more subtle and harder to detect. But this Leonel Morales seemed to be another wild variable thrown into the fuel. Chapter 1414. Published at 6th of December 2022 8:05 and 42 seconds AM. Chapter 1414. Twice if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Leonel shot up, his body covered in cold sweats as he breathed heavily. When a normal person hyperventilated, maybe the worst thing that would happen was lighthead and some noise. However, when someone like Leonel did so, it was like the entire room had become infused with a raging tornado. Winds whipped into the surroundings, crashing against the walls and sending whatever was light enough to not remain anchored down spiraling into the surroundings. It took Leonel several moments before he realized he was no longer stuck, but the fear made his heart thrum. He couldn't be sure, was this really the real world? Leonel looked down, finding Aina sleeping soundly on his lap. Even through all the commotion, she remained in a deep sleep. She sat in a chair by Leonel's side, leaning forward to rest her cheek on him. There was definitely more than enough room in bed for her to sleep by his side, but she must have been worried about him not healing properly. Seeing her sleeping so peacefully helped Leonel's heart rate to calm considerably. Bit by bit, his heavy breathing slowed and returned to a normal cadence. N0VL next. "Comb, what happened to me?" Leonel's brows furrowed. He subconsciously checked over his body, but what he found was even more difficult to accept than anything he had put the crowd observing him through. It was so baffling that he almost couldn't accept it. Had he been in a coma for years? It was the only way he could explain what he was seeing. No, that didn't make sense. With years, considering Aina's talent, she would have most definitely progressed into the 6th dimension. There was no way she would still be at the 5th. Leonel had no one he could ask except why Star Order. He almost felt stupid doing so, knowing full well that the old man shouldn't have been able to see what was going on in the tower. But something compelled him to do so anyway, feeling that he had nowhere else to turn to. "Old man? What the hell happened to me?" This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. To experience faster update speed. Leonel's question was met by a long silence. At first, he thought the old man was taking his time to respond, something that happens sometimes. But as the seconds ticked by, Leonel felt that there was something wrong. Where were the snide remarks? The sarcastic comebacks? The rain of insults? Leonel sent his mind into the segmented cube and what he saw left him frozen. There was nothing. An empty, vast nothingness. No, this wasn't entirely true. In the place of what should have been Leonel's greatest reliances, there was an odd swirling portal and fragments of space. The only time he had ever seen something like this was when he entered subdimensional zones, but there was very clearly no zone magically hiding within his segmented cube. Realizing what this could mean, Leonel's expression went ashen. He rarely reacted like this to any change. In fact, he could ever remember reacting like this to anything. However, if he was correct, this sort of event warranted exactly this kind of shock and horror. The segmented cube was ultimately a powerful spatial tool. If the inside of it looks like this, then the only explanation was that the inner space of the segmented cube collapsed, taking with it everything that had been within. The bronze and silver tablet, the cleansing waters, the tentacle womb, Star Order, the 2 savants, and Little Black Star. Novel Bin. Leonel's heart seized, his jaw clenching tight. He didn't want to believe it, but he didn't have any other explanation. The resources he could accept the loss of. He had no idea what happened, but things were ultimately things. He could even accept the loss of Y's Star Order. Though the old man had been useful, Lionel had already lost count of the number of times he had tried to kill him. Even the tentacle womb and the golden-scaled koi fish, he could get over it. However, little black star, candle and vice. That he could not accept. Lionel's gaze flashed with red, his teeth clenching so hard the blood dripped down from their crevices. What happened? What happened? What happened to him? This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net Lionel balled his fists trying to calm himself down, but he found it hard to do so. There had to be a way to reverse this, a way to turn it back around. The segmented cube was the heirloom of the Morales family. How could it possibly collapse so easily? How could something like this happen? No, there has to be a way. I don't believe it. Lionel wouldn't accept that this could just happen. Little Black Star had been injured, but Lionel had always been keeping up with him. Thanks to Lionel killing the Shadow Sovereign, the little guy had been able to absorb another shadow world into himself, strengthening him and helping him to heal faster. By the time Lionel had entered the Void Tower, little Black Star had already recovered to easily 90% and was prepared to surpass his former self. This was all to say that given his abilities, the one most likely to survive the collapse of a spatial device was most definitely the little mink. It was impossible for little Black Star to just sit there and wait for death. Even if the little guy couldn't save everything, he could most definitely save himself. Wait, connection. Lionel placed a hand to his chest. If little Black Star had died, their connection would have definitely been severed. Even though Lionel couldn't feel little Black Star right now, he knew that their connection was still intact. This thought helped Lionel to relax slightly, but it still wasn't enough for him to settle down all his worries. There has to be a way, but I won't find it by panicking. I need to find out what happened in these last few days, and to do that, I'll need to first understand the changes to my body. Maybe then I can get an inkling as to why the change was so drastic. The change wasn't just a little drastic, actually. The main reason Lionel had been shocked was because the Snowy Star Owl lineage factor wasn't within him any longer. It had evolved. Twice. Chapter 14-15. Published at 6th of December 2022 8:05 and 41 seconds AM. Chapter 14-15. Awakenings. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Somehow, without his control or consent, Lionel's Snowy Star Owl lineage factor had become the Starry-tailed Fox lineage factor. Not only that, but it had completed all of its awakening completely. Just the base strength Lionel's body right now was beyond anything he had ever felt before. It was as thought his body had been injected with steroids. The Starry-tailed Fox had 3 branches as well. The Speed branch, the Healing branch, and the Wisdom Spirit branch. Y's Star Order had never been able to explain to Lionel exactly what Wisdom Spirit branch meant, but experiencing it now, Lionel felt like he was almost walking on clouds. To the Snowy Star Owl, the Wisdom branch was simple. It only represented the mind and its dimension in addition to the senses. Each awakening either increased the strength of the mind or the eyes. In combination, they became the greatest embodiment of the Snowy Star Owl's sensory capabilities. The Wisdom Spirit branch, though, went beyond just senses. Or, at least it went beyond senses in just its normal and rawest form. It also happened to extend to senses of the spirit, or in other words, the very same sort of oneness with their surroundings that spirituals felt. If Lionel was any other person rising to the 4th awakening of the Wisdom Spirit branch, his light and star elemental affinity would skyrocket to realms beyond words. He would gain the ability to control atmospheric light and star elemental forces as though he was breathing, and he would also find that increasing his strength through the use of light and star elemental forces had become vastly easier. These benefits didn't bother to mention other miscellaneous matters such as better control over the light and star elements as well, along with many other related matters. Unfortunately, a 7th-dimensional lineage factor, even one that sat at the pinnacle of the world, wasn't enough to grant Lionel any of these benefits because, quite frankly, he already had them. The Starry-tailed Fox wasn't strong enough to outclass an innate node like Lionel's, especially not when it was so outrageously large to begin with. However, this didn't mean that Lionel had gained nothing from the 4 awakenings. Firstly, his mind had climbed to the pinnacle of the 6th dimension. It would have entered the 7th, however his Bodhis limitations had stopped it from growing any further. Even with all of said limitations, Lionel's split minds could only be counted on orders of hundreds of millions now. Secondly, and maybe Lionel's favorite benefit, Lionel could use light and star elemental force to replenish his tired mind. He didn't have to sleep if he didn't want to, but this wouldn't be what Lionel used it for. Instead, he was more interested in the fact that the state of fatigue his mind had reached before would be much harder for him to hit now, even if he was using his destruction runes. The third benefit was related to the third and fourth awakenings of the wisdom branch. The first two awakenings elevated Lionel's mind to what should have been the pinnacle of the seventh dimension and gave him the gaze of the starry-tailed fox. The latter worked similarly to the snowy star owl's eyes, but was much more potent and even carried with it a dazing sort of effect that was similar to how Lionel's king's might worked. The third and fourth awakenings, though, were related to the namesake of the starry-tailed fox, their tails. Upon entering a battle state, long, large and illusory white tails would appear to Lionel's back. Each tail was like a powerful black hole, pulling in the exact sort of force it wanted and forming a domain with it. The starry-tailed fox had three tails: the tail of light, the tail of stars, and the tail of spirit. With them, Lionel could form a starry light domain, a starry star domain, and a starry spirit domain. From what Lionel could tell, the starry light domain was both defensive and evasive, working in tandem with the speed branch. The starry star domain was defensive and worked well to control a battlefield, especially if there were many enemies. The starry spirit domain was a sensory domain that elevated beyond internal sight. In addition, it also worked similarly to a spiritual medium, forming the illusory tail as its core. There were many things Lionel could think of using it for if he combined its effects with his mage core. The healing branch raised what Lionel had experienced with the snowy star owl to a completely different level. The first awakening granted his instantaneous recovery once again, but the potency was beyond imagining. Lionel had a feeling that this had to be what had healed his right hand even though he couldn't remember using it. The second awakening granted him his passive healing factor, something that when stacked with a fully awakened wisdom spirit branch would hardly allow him to get nicked without instantly healing. Though, this reality only made the fact that he had been so heavily injured to begin with even more baffling. The third awakening granted him access to the starry-tailed fox's bestial transformation. Though he had never seen it, he could probably guess what it would look like. N0VL next. Koem finally, the fourth awakening amplified everything to its extreme, allowing him the ability to once again use instantaneous recovery once a day. As for the final speed branch, Lionel had grown numb enough to not continuously feel shock, but he could already feel that his speed was mind-numbing. The final awakening of the speed branch when fused with the starry light domain practically gave Lionel instantaneous teleportation abilities. Matched with his mind, so long as his stamina kept up, Lionel truly couldn't see how anyone below the sixth dimension could last a few rounds against him. Well, maybe aside from this masochist girlfriend of his. After going through all of this, Lionel managed to calm his heart a bit. But as fast as his mind was now, it was only a matter of time before he stumbled into a new problem. One heirloom seemed to be completely ruined. So what about this other? Lionel slowly turned his attention to the spear domain ring, his heart trying to beat out of his chest. He had hardly sent his mind toward it when his pupils constricted. Chapter 1416. Published at 6th of December 2022 8:05 and 39 seconds AM. Chapter 1416. Spatial destruction. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The spear domain ring looked as though a hurricane had rampaged through it. Spear peaks had been flattened, spears that managed to survive the carnage had been ripped out of the ground and wildly strewn about, and it might have been a figment of Lionel's imagination, but it also felt like the rumbling storm above was also far more violent than it ever had been before, as though the entire domain had been provoked. Arcs of thick black lightning continuously rained down the tallest peak in the distance. The scene half left Lionel in a trance where he couldn't take his eyes off of the magnificence, and another half of him felt as though the lightning was crashing into his mind, threatening to tear him apart piece by piece. This scene made Lionel realize that what happened to his segmented cube couldn't have possibly been a coincidence. Whatever happened while he was out happened to both. But this realization made something else settle in for Lionel, his mind sparking and his thinking speed heading into overdrive. This opens up a separate sort of possibility for what might have happened to the segmented cube. Originally, if I had to guess what happened to it, I would have assumed that it was related to however I ended up injured. The Void Tower was supposed to be a virtual trial. However, if the change to my mind somehow allowed my dream force to mess with that process, then the lines between virtual and reality could have blurred. If I was forming a virtual reality simulation in the dimensional verse, I wouldn't use technology. The obvious choice would be dream force. If manipulated properly, you could make things as realistic as you wanted them, and rely on the processing strength inherent to the human mind to deal with it all. But let's say that barrier is breached. If you're toying with that line, then injuries would theoretically be the obvious result of crossing a safety line that shouldn't be crossed. That doesn't exactly explain how what should be illusions could injure me, but the answer to that isn't exactly important right this moment. What is important is that if that line was crossed, what else would distort? I would assume that fundamental laws related to gravity, electromagnetism, and especially space would be the first to distort. And, in the case something like that happened, wouldn't the segmented cube obviously collapse no matter how high grade of a treasure it was? Even as his mind worked at warp speed, Lionel did the only thing he could to check this: the spatial bristle rings. Most of the spatial bristle rings Lionel had been traded in for points. But he had kept just one on his person in case of future issues. But when Lionel looked at the finger he had kept it on as expected, it was no longer there. Lionel could imagine that if the space of a spatial bristle ring collapsed on his finger, it would have most definitely taken his finger and most of his hand with it. But here was his hand perfectly fine. This isn't the first time I've dealt with warping spatial rings either. Whenever you take a lower-level dimensional ring into a higher one, the space within shrinks. When you take it back to a lower-level dimension, the space within increases once again. The spatial rings are always responding to their environments. The theory is sound. But that is just the first step. The next logical step is how. I didn't think about this earlier because I let my emotions get the best of me, but any collapsing space is not some quiet event. The casing around it would definitely suffer as well. But why is it that the segmented cube is still perfectly shaved into a jigsaw-like finger glove? The only explanation is that someone or something stabilized it and protected it. There was only one thing that Lionel could think of that could possibly do this. The image of an illusory little girl came to mind. Novel top 1. Or if the segmented cube had an AI of sorts protecting it, what would that AI decide to do in the case that Lionel's actions placed it and everything it protected in danger? The obvious course of action would be evasive maneuvers. Now the question was, how could he get it to come back? One problem at a time. Lionel's gaze narrowed, turning his attention back to the spear domain ring. It was clear that whatever hardship the segmented cube had been forced into, so too had the spear domain gone through. But rather than the spear domain folding or running, it fought back and eventually managed to stabilize its space. The result of that, though, was a far more volatile and dangerous world, not to mention the destruction of many spears. The good news was that many of these spears would be able to heal themselves in time. However, the bad news was far heavier. For one, the difficulty of crossing through the spear domain had increased far more than 1,000-fold. Lionel had been standing within the black grade region of the ring just now, and yet he still felt like his mind was about to collapse. Usually, he appeared in the last place he had left, but seemingly sensing his weakness and protecting him, the spear domain had shuffled him all the way back. Secondly, due to this change, Lionel lost access to even the quasi-bronze spears he had been fond of. This wasn't because they were being repaired as some had still managed to survive. It was because he quite literally could not reach them. Lionel had gone from being able to enter the silver grade region, to not even being able to freely walk throughout the black grade region. Let alone calling out his quasi-gold spear, he would be hard-pressed to claim a black grade spear from the ones around him. It felt like he was right back to square one, standing at the same place he had been when he hadn't even completed his nodes yet. Chapter 1417. Published at 6th of December 2022 8:05 and 38 seconds AM. Chapter 1417. Mage Core Tree. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Toward this, Lionel could only sigh. He had just been feeling like he was making great progress with the spear domain. He had finally gained a small bit of its acknowledgement, his spear force was rapidly evolving every day, and he had finally claimed a quasi-gold spear, only to be shuffled right back to step 1. Lionel couldn't help but feel that there was a small sense of irony to this. The moment Lionel thought that he should maybe stop emphasizing peak spears so much and focus a little bit more on the spears beneath him, he was thrust into a situation where if that would seem like a privilege. Truthfully, Lionel would feel pretty depressed about this setback if he had truly gotten nothing in return for it. But the change to his lineage factor was just one of the changes that had occurred in Lionel's body during these last few days. If little Blackstar was truly safe and just shuttled off to some pocket of space by the spirit of the segmented cube, then this sort of trade-off wasn't bad. In fact, Lionel could be said to be benefiting. The second most obvious change to Lionel was the evolution of his mage core. Although he couldn't understand what had happened, it almost felt as though an answer to everything he needed was already engraved onto his heart. N0VL next. Koem. The mage core had become a looming canopy within Lionel's ethereal glabella. If one was looking from afar, it looked a lot more like an entire forest than a singular tree. Lionel almost couldn't believe it when he saw it again for the first time. The mage core had lost its petals and flower-like characteristics. Instead, it had become an enormous tree with countless millions of leaves and branches. However, what was truly special was the fact that these leaves were multicolored, each representing a different element and each engraved with a rune. These runes looked completely different from the ones Lionel had seen on the blue apes he fought on floor 9, but the feeling they gave off was practically identical. It was an esoteric sort of feeling, as though they were elevated in being and worth, touching upon something Lionel couldn't quite understand fundamentally, but could somehow still grasp. It was almost as though Lionel was reading a book and had stumbled upon a word he couldn't understand. However, thanks to the words and context around it, his guess was accurate as the definition itself. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. To experience faster update speed. If he focused, he could understand what the individual runes meant, but if he wanted a holistic understanding of them all and how they fed into one another and played off of one another, he would need maybe months, probably years. You would think it would be easier than that with all his split minds. But Lionel found that if he tried to split himself to understand things, the clear definition he had in his head would blur. He didn't have a clear reasoning for why this would be unless, but he had a guess. If whatever was controlling things while my mind was stuck in my dream world comprehended all of these runes at once, then that would mean that the bits and pieces of understanding are all spread out and won't be focused unless I train all of my minds on a singular rune. Lionel frowned slightly. He couldn't ever remember his split minds working like this. Aside from Dream Counter, where he would always assign one mind to a task, the rest had always been fluid and interchangeable. But this felt as though his split minds had all been tagged and assigned to a separate control center. Wow, it's no wonder Lionel couldn't deny it. While this made things more difficult on him comprehending the changes to his mage core, it made his thinking speed and efficiency far higher than it ever had been. Before, he had still been stuck in his ways, still trying to use his split minds the same way as always. But when he fell in line with the changes, it was as though some had pressed down on an accelerator hard. His thoughts became like bolts of lightning, almost completing before he had even decided to use them. His intention was almost lagging behind his actual thoughts. Lionel was almost lost in the world of his own mind again. But this time it was completely intentional. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. With the way his mind worked before, when he needed to deduce something he would work linearly. When one line of thought failed he would abandon it and then proceed on to the next thought. However, with how it worked now, he could simultaneously think through every possibility and even have them ranked by probability and likelihood before his former self could even switch to a new line of thought. Lionel realized that if he had used this method to think back when he first met Y-Star Order, it would have been impossible for the old man to read his intentions by shifting through 10 million minds because every mind would have already had the same intention. It was just that that intention would have been broken up into little tidbits and divided 10 million times, making it almost impossible for anyone other than Lionel to piece them together and understand them. The irony of this was that it was using Lionel's several hundred million split minds as though they were all one mind. And somehow that still made it all more efficient. Lionel took a deep breath. Even if I can't understand my mage core entirely though, the result is almost too obvious. Lionel reached out a hand and force surged toward him as though it had a mind of its own. He could always do this. However, he had never been able to replicate this feat in a world of dense anarchic force. Most of Lionel's ability to use atmospheric force was locked away in this place. Even the golden-scaled koi fish could only pull in force fused with anarchic force. But right now, so long as it was an element found on his mage core, Lionel could force it toward himself, ignoring all the anarchic force around him. Suddenly the air sparked and a ball of red-gold flames formed and began to rotate upon Lionel's palm. Scarlet Star Force. Not just any Scarlet Force, but fifth-dimensional Scarlet Star Force. Chapter 1418. Published at 6th of December 2022 8:05 and 37 seconds AM. Chapter 1418. Of all people? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel didn't know what to think for a long time. This force, this very same force that had been the bane of his existence ever since he had awakened it, was now sitting obediently in his palm. Lionel knew it was lacking in many ways. This force on his palm now compared to the force he could emit from his innate node in the same way force crystals differed from pure force crystals. The gap was enormous. However, it was still with this very same force that Lionel had wiped out a troop of three-finger cult members, and then proceeded to toy with a variant invalid as though each was no more than an ant. And now, he could suddenly use as much of this force as he wanted. To say that this change was huge was an understatement. Lionel quickly snuffed out the flame, realizing that Aina was beginning to sweat beneath the heat. If not for her, he might not have realized something was wrong until the walls began to melt. If this wasn't a seventh-dimensional world, the air would have already heated enough to combust everything around it into a hail of flames. The force on Lionel's palm shifted. He went through water force, spatial force, light force, star force. He even managed to gather enough earth force that he could influence the ground beneath him a bit. Though none of these were as exaggerated as the formation of a ball of scarlet star force, Lionel could still tell that the strength behind each force was far more than it had been in the past, and the only possible explanation was the runes that made up the leaves of his mage core. Lionel summarized the next few changes to his body quickly. His fourth-dimensional innate node, the very one he had taken back from Miguel, had found a home in his left kidney. An odd sort of dream force barrier wrapped tightly around it. Lionel hadn't noticed it at first due to its small size, but after a diligent scan he couldn't possibly miss it. Lionel felt that he could puncture this dream force barrier whenever he wanted, as his dream force affinity seemed to have finally returned to him, but he didn't do it. This dream force barrier seemed to make the innate node ignorant to the fact it had returned to his body. This allowed him to benefit from having true Scarlet Star force circulate throughout his body without the drawbacks. When Lionel was ready for it to evolve, he felt that he could just remove a layer of the barrier, allowing it to grow in size. Like this, Lionel could get the benefit of the accelerated growth of one innate node and the steady growth of another. He had a feeling that this would greatly help his comprehension as he watched the destruction runes grow naturally. The next change he noticed was in the number of destruction runes he had comprehended. But since these were fused with his mage core, he left alone. The final change, however, was one that left Lionel speechless once again, something that had happened far too often today. Lionel waved a hand. The world around him seemed to distort, delicate sparkling lines of blue coming together until they formed a perfect cube. Everything about the hologram was exact. There was a 0% margin of error, completely unrealistic even to the standards of the higher dimensions. Without fail, every side was exactly 4 inches long, not a measure more, not a measure less. However, the most shocking thing was that this image had been projected from Lionel's mind. The first thing Lionel did when he noticed this was panic again. Had he been flung back into a dream world without his knowledge? But after a moment he calmed again. No, this wasn't a dream world, this was definitely the real world. There was no doubt about it. But he had gained the ability to project his dream force. No, it isn't like that. Within the confines of my starry spirit domain, I can project dream force. However, outside of it I cannot. Even within the range of my internal sight is impossible. It only seems to be something I can accomplish within this domain. Without his tail active, Lionel's starry spirit domain was barely a foot out from his skin. With it active, it had a radius of about 5 meters. Whatever change this sensory domain had allowed, it became like an extension of Lionel's dream world. Lionel had known there would be a lot to explore when it came to this new domain of his, but he hadn't expected to stumble upon the first discovery like this. Lionel had dismissed this ability when he was stuck in his dream world, thinking that it would only make him a good teacher and communicator. But now, feeling it in the real world, he realized just how game-changing this ability would be. He almost wanted to stand up right this moment and begin crafting, but that was when it hit him like a ton of bricks. I lost little Tali too. Lionel's fists clenched. He had to find a way to reverse this as soon as possible. He knew there had to be a way. Lionel. Lionel was suddenly tackled down by a soft body. Before he could understand what was happening, 2 small palms clasped his cheeks, pressing them together as though to check he was truly alive. Lionel's lips pursed out of his control, his eyes blinking as he looked up toward Aina, who already sat over him. Seeing the worry in Aina's eyes, Lionel's heart softened a bit. But when she tried to kiss him, he dodged and hoisted her over his shoulder. No time for horniness today, ma'am, we have work to do. I have to find out how to save an adorable little mink and an equally as adorable silver blob. Aina was so stunned that she didn't even react to Lionel conveniently squeezing one of her large cheeks as she was halved over his shoulder. Did this man just accuse her of being horny? This man of all people. Chapter 1419. Published at 6th of December 2022, 8:05 and 35 seconds AM. Chapter 1419. Void contract. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Soft. Lionel nodded to himself. Aina seemed to snap awake at these words, slapping Lionel's hand away from her ass and pushing herself up and off his shoulder. She harumphed, pulling her skirt down to hide anything indecent and smoothing out the wrinkles. Once she was finished, she gave Lionel a nice, long glare. But in return she received a chuckle. "What's with that look? Weren't you just happy to see me?" "Not anymore." "Oh, if I give you a kiss, will it make you feel better?" "No one wants your kiss," Aina spoke, waving a hand and walking out in front, ignoring Lionel. Lionel laughed, swiftly catching up and taking Aina's hand. Though she put up some mock resistance, she eventually stopped. It was all too easy to tell the difference. With her strength, shaking off his hand if she really wanted to wouldn't be difficult at all. "Where is this place?" Lionel couldn't help but notice that this place was particularly white. It was completely unlike the dark regions he had gotten used to in the last several days. Well, aside from the 10th floor of the Void Tower, that is. This place, though, was obviously not in the Void Tower, and it had a distinct medicinal scent in the air. "It's a hospital, obviously. Who asked you to come out of the tower with a hole in your chest? What the hell happened to you?" Aina frowned, her slightly annoyed tone shifting to concern as she looked toward Lionel. The more she thought about it, the less it made sense to her as well. It was supposed to be a simulation. During her own death, she had become an old woman after expending all of her life force, and her bones practically crumbled under the weight of her flesh. It was quite gruesome, but she eventually woke up just fine as though nothing had happened. If even a death like that couldn't harm her, then what could have possibly harmed Lionel? "I'm not sure. A hospital? It wasn't free, right? How did you pay for it? Did you get leaderboard rewards already?" "About that, your cousin?" "My cousin?" Novel top one. Lionel's brows shot up. The only cousin he knew of was Noah, but he had a feeling that Aina wasn't talking about him. Noah should be just as unable to pay for his treatment as Aina was. It wouldn't make sense for Aina to be referring to him. "Yes. His name was Sio. He said he was the 4th Nova." Lionel's eyes narrowed. The 4th Nova. Though there were over 1 billion recognized to be among the Morales family's Nova generation, the only ones who gained numbers and titles like this were the 7 who had awakened both lineage factors. What did he ask for in return? Lionel still had the segmented cube and the spear domain with him, so it was obvious that his cousin hadn't asked for them. Though even if he had, Lionel doubted the spear domain would leave him. As for the segmented cube, it seemed to have a spirit of its own. However, in its current state, it was just an empty shell anyone could take for themselves. Regardless, 4th Nova hadn't taken it either. "He said that you owe him one favor and he wants 10% interest compounded daily. He made me sign a Void contract, which is apparently a legal document overseen by the Void Senate. Any disputes are handled through the Senate or its branches." Lionel felt uneasy hearing these words. The interest alone was ridiculous, but the favor sounded. Lionel didn't believe that Aina would ever make him return a favor that was too ridiculous, so there were definitely stipulations. But as for what they were, he didn't know. "Can I see the contract?" Aina handed over what looked like a pendant without its necklace to him after hesitating a moment, and his starry spirit domain acted all on its own. Its information was displayed before him and he read through it all in the blink of an eye. But by the time he had finished, his expression was as dark as the Void Palace's usual environment. He realized now why Aina had seemingly hesitated, even if just for a moment. The collateral for this contract was essentially Aina's life. Even though the Void Palace didn't allow death, slavery was another matter entirely. If Lionel couldn't fulfill the contract within a month's time, Aina would be forced to work under Sio. Lionel's mother had already been here for over 20 years, and she still couldn't leave the Void Palace freely. This meant that even if this contract was only observed within these walls, something that was unlikely to be true to begin with, that Aina would be stuck fulfilling this contract for at least that long. And, considering the fact the Void Palace, and by proxy the Void Senate, were the most powerful existences in the human domain, even leaving this place didn't mean that you could ignore a contract witnessed by them. This much alone was more than enough to piss Lionel off. Aina was unaware, so he didn't blame her. But so long as he held on for just one more day, he could have completely healed himself after his recharged. In fact, so long as Lionel had been given a space without anarchic force to contend with, his healing factor would have been more than enough to allow him to recover to his full strength. Beyond this, the description left for the favor left Lionel unsettled. The restrictions placed on it were heavy. Aina had insisted that such a favor couldn't go against Lionel's moral code, but as a rebuttal 4th Nova seemed to slip in that said moral code had to be provable by Lionel's actions. That line alone was something Lionel knew Aina wouldn't accept unless she felt pushed into a corner. It practically undid all of the restrictions so long as the clause was used cleverly. Lionel didn't think his mood could get any worse, but when he saw the bill, his temper threatened to flare up again, and only grew worse when he recognized the green hair of the woman across from him. Chapter 1420? Published at 6th of December 2022 8:05 and 33 seconds AM. Chapter 1420. A month. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Ana's frown was even deeper than Lionel's, her palm pressed down hard on the counter, applying enough pressure to make the marbling tremble. And yet her voice was as calm and cold as ice. Golden glow root. White azala oak. Silkworm grass. These are all fifth-dimensional herbs priced at barely a few dozen kilograms of herb. Oregon itchweed. Crimson hair skunk root. Queen spruce bushel. Poison thistle plum. These aren't even medicines, they're quite literally poison. I wouldn't have allowed you within a mile of him if you had entered with these things. Do you take us for idiots? The green-haired woman continued to look toward them, not looking away in the slightest. There wasn't a hint of embarrassment on her face. The price is as stated. 1,029,293 void points and 2 void merits. Ana's irises flashed with a golden glow, the marbled counter cracking. The green-haired woman looked down at the result, her eyes narrowing. It took far more than just a bit of strength to cause such a thing to happen, especially when there was no wind-up. The price is now double. The green-haired woman reached forward with lightning speed to take back the invoice, catching Ana off guard. But before she could succeed, she found her wrist lightly gripped. The strength wasn't too strong, and it could even be said that the hold on her hand was more comfortable than not. And yet she couldn't seem to budge even a single inch. Her name was Rosamond, I believe. Is that right? Lionel said lightly. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Calm to experience faster update speed. His anger seemed to have vanished into the wind. Rosamond was the very same woman who had manned the medical center at Village 0012. Truthfully, Lionel hadn't done much of anything to her. In addition, after displaying the strength he had during the True Selection, and subsequently within the Void Tower, even if what he did past Floor 9 was ignored, he had already proven himself to be more than worth of the Amethyst token. N0VL next. Come in doing that, the reason Rosamond should have had for being disgusted with him should have likewise vanished. But it seems that Rosamond was the type of person who didn't like to take losses. Lionel had left her medicinal center alone because he didn't want to be the reason other people didn't get treatment, but she had taken his actions to be out of fear of her. So, he had blatantly stated that if she ever became the reason one of his friends or brothers couldn't get treatment, he wouldn't care about the Void Palace's rules and would directly kill her. Clearly, she had taken these words very personally, even to the point of trying to retaliate in this way. With the way the Void Palace worked, everything run on the power of its students. There was a reason why Vega could offer Ana free discounts from stores, and that was because they were controlled by her faction to begin with. Every establishment was either owned by a faction or an individual student. This was for an obvious reason: they were raising the future leaders of the human domain and as such, treated them with the proper freedom, within certain parameters of course. So long as they remained within the Void Palace, didn't have children and didn't kill, they could practically do as they pleased, all the way up until even running the daily functions of the Void Palace through the Void Senate. These rules weren't too oppressive at all. They had to stay in the Void Palace so that they could constantly be under a state of duress and training. If they could leave as they pleased, who would choose to remain here? By then the effectiveness would plummet. As for children, they couldn't have little brats running around the Void Palace, right? And killing was an even more obvious measure that protected everyone from being pushed too far. However, it was also because of this approach that this was happening at all. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. Inwardly, Lionel smiled. He didn't believe that only this family controlled all of the hospitals and medical centers of the Void Palace. There were definitely others. Signs pointed toward the fact that CEO had brought Ana and him here on purpose, knowing the prices would be inflated. As for how he knew that Lionel had a grudge with Rosamond, that was something that Lionel would have to find out on his own. Still, it was clear that this fourth cousin of his was schemer. It was just unfortunate that he had already touched past Lionel's bottom line because as of this moment, he was playing with Ana's life. However, Lionel managed to keep his calm, sliding the invoice off of the table and taking it into his hands. He didn't care for the green-haired woman's answer to his question. He already knew the truth. This is the invoice, huh? They'll be taking my copy. Be sure to charge that to that cousin of mine. Lionel handed the invoice to Ana. Since he didn't have a spatial ring anymore, he'd have to rely on this girlfriend of his. As they walked out, his mind was spinning. There were too many loopholes in the contract. Just with a glance he could see dozens. If CEO was determined to take advantage of them, he could do so. In fact, he could just hide for the next coming month and show up 31 days later claiming that Lionel never paid him, using that as an excuse to sweep Aina away. With this contract, Seo could even go as far as to force Aina to fight in the air wars for him. While killing amongst heirs was prohibited, killing the helpers of heirs was a different matter entirely. If not for this, why would Valiant Heart Mountain have been so scared to participate? Or, there was the possibility that if his mind was more sinister, Lionel shut his mind down from continuing down that path as quickly as he thought it, but with his current thinking speed, he had already plunged down a seemingly endless rabbit hole. The more he considered it, the more enraged he would become. There was only one option. He had to find a way to void this contract. And for that, he needed to read the rules. To make matters more difficult, he needed a method that didn't rely on the Void Senate, and he only had a month to both find it and put it into action. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1421. Published at 6th of December 2022 8:05 and 32 seconds AM. Chapter 1421. A month. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Aina's frown was even deeper than Lionel's, her palm pressed down hard on the counter, applying enough pressure to make the marbling tremble. And yet her voice was as calm and cold as ice. Golden glow root. White azala oak. Silkworm grass. These are all fifth-dimensional herbs priced at barely a few dozen kilograms of herb Oregon itchweed. Crimson hair skunk root. Queen spruce bushel. Poison thistle plum. These aren't even medicines, they're quite literally poison. I wouldn't have allowed you within a mile of him if you had entered with these things. Do you take us for idiots? The green-haired woman continued to look toward them, not looking away in the slightest. There wasn't a hint of embarrassment on her face. The price is as stated. 1,029,293 void points and 2 void merits. Aina's irises flashed with a golden glow, the marbled counter cracking. The green-haired woman looked down at the result, her eyes narrowing. It took far more than just a bit of strength to cause such a thing to happen, especially when there was no wind-up. The price is now double. The green-haired woman reached forward with lightning speed to take back the invoice, catching Aina off guard. But before she could succeed, she found her wrist lightly gripped. The strength wasn't too strong, and it could even be said that the hold on her hand was more comfortable than not. And yet, she couldn't seem to budge even a single inch. Novel. Her name was Rosamond, I believe. Is that right? Lionel said lightly. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed. His anger seemed to have vanished into the wind. Rosamond was the very same woman who had manned the medical center at Village 0012. Truthfully, Lionel hadn't done much of anything to her. In addition, after displaying the strength he had during the True Selection, and subsequently within the Void Tower, even if what he did past Floor 9 was ignored, he had already proven himself to be more than worth of the amethyst token. In doing that, the reason Rosamond should have had for being disgusted with him should have likewise vanished. But it seems that Rosamond was the type of person who didn't like to take losses. Lionel had left her medicinal center alone because he didn't want to be the reason other people didn't get treatment, but she had taken his actions to be out of fear of her. So, he had blatantly stated that if she ever became the reason one of his friends or brothers couldn't get treatment, he wouldn't care about the Void Palace's rules and would directly kill her. Clearly, she had taken these words very personally, even to the point of trying to retaliate in this way. With the way the Void Palace worked, everything run on the power of its students. There was a reason why Vega could offer Aina free discounts from stores, and that was because they were controlled by her faction to begin with. Every establishment was either owned by a faction or an individual student. This was for an obvious reason: they were raising the future leaders of the human domain and as such, treated them with the proper freedom, within certain parameters of course. So long as they remained within the Void Palace, didn't have children and didn't kill, they could practically do as they pleased, all the way up until even running the daily functions of the Void Palace through the Void Senate. These rules weren't too oppressive at all. They had to stay in the Void Palace so that they could constantly be under a state of duress and training. If they could leave as they pleased, who would choose to remain here? By then the effectiveness would plummet. As for children, they couldn't have little brats running around the Void Palace, right? And killing was an even more obvious measure that protected everyone from being pushed too far. However, it was also because of this approach that this was happening at all. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. Inwardly, Lionel smiled. He didn't believe that only this family controlled all of the hospitals and medical centers of the Void Palace. There were definitely others. Signs pointed toward the fact that Sio had brought Aina and him here on purpose, knowing the prices would be inflated. As for how he knew that Lionel had a grudge with Rosamond, that was something that Lionel would have to find out on his own. Still, it was clear that this fourth cousin of his was schemer. It was just unfortunate that he had already touched past Lionel's bottom line because as of this moment, he was playing with Aina's life. However, Lionel managed to keep his calm, sliding the invoice off of the table and taking it into his hands. He didn't care for the green-haired woman's answer to his question. He already knew the truth. "This is the invoice, huh? They'll be taking my copy. Be sure to charge that to that cousin of mine." Lionel handed the invoice to Aina. Since he didn't have a spatial ring anymore, he'd have to rely on this girlfriend of his. As they walked out, his mind was spinning. There were too many loopholes in the contract. Just with a glance he could see dozens. If Sio was determined to take advantage of them, he could do so. In fact, he could just hide for the next coming month and show up 31 days later claiming that Lionel never paid him, using that as an excuse to sweep Aina away. With this contract, Sio could even go as far as to force Aina to fight in the air wars for him. While killing amongst heirs was prohibited, killing the helpers of heirs was a different matter entirely. If not for this, why would Valiant Heart Mountain have been so scared to participate? Or, there was the possibility that if his mind was more sinister, Lionel shut his mind down from continuing down that path as quickly as he thought it, but with his current thinking speed, he had already plunged down a seemingly endless rabbit hole. The more he considered it, the more enraged he would become. There was only one option. He had to find a way to void this contract. And for that, he needed to read the rules. To make matters more difficult, he needed a method that didn't rely on the Void Senate, and he only had a month to both find it and put it into action. You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.